Gnosticism and Gnosis, to say the least, are very squirrely terms. When we describe something as Gnostic, we can pretty much get away with almost whatever we want to. So much so that many scholars who study the most classic sense of Gnosticism, which are the movements of late antiquity surrounding Christianity, overlapping with certain apocalyptic Judaic tendencies as well as some pagan mysteries. And this is really where the idea of Gnosticism and Gnostics come from. But even when discussing these matters, some scholars believe that the term Gnosticism has been so misabused or abused and misplaced over the years that it's better just to abandon the term and come up with something else. So why this complexity, which we have to wrestle with if we're going to feel confident in talking about Gnosticism and in getting a sense that we're actually understanding something specific rather than having a new word to throw around? Well, one of the reasons for this is that most of what we knew about Gnosticism, at least before 1945, when the famous discovery of the Nag Hammadi library of Coptic codices occurred, most of what we knew about Gnosticism came through the mouths of its enemies. And so much so that the term Gnostic was actually a kind of almost a term of abuse. And right off the bat, there's a kind of fundamental disturbance in our understanding, because if you were to read the Orthodox heresiarchs, those who pursued and sometimes quite relentlessly suppressed things that they characterized as Gnostic, that from these guys' perspective, Gnosticism was, of course, a heresy, an evil distortion of the true religion. But already this is an enormous distortion, because there was no true religion at the point at which the Gnostics were really got going, and we're talking about the first, second, and especially second and third centuries after Jesus, before Rome became Christian, at a very crazy time of many, many different paths and gods and mysteries spreading through the anxious and in some ways very familiar milieu of the late Roman Empire. That during this time there was no Orthodox exactly, and what you had really was a collection of Christianities. For while Gnosticism stretches beyond Christianity, it is largely Christian Gnosticism that we have as our sort of basis for understanding what Gnosticism is. So at this point, there are many different tendencies in Christianity, many different Christianities, many of them grabbing onto different texts, some of which eventually became collected in the New Testament of the Bible, and many, or if not most of which, were left by the wayside, becoming for later people heresies or misbegotten ideas, mistakes, and errors. But in the milieu of the 1st and 2nd century, there's simply another facet of things. And within this wide range of possibilities, there were quite a number that later scholars were able to identify as Gnostic. So if the fact that our understanding of Gnosticism came about largely through its enemies is part of our initial distortion, another distortion or difficulty or challenge is introduced by the scholars. Because, of course, scholars love to categorize. They love to pin those butterflies in their proper little slots and name them and organize them. And in fact, a lot of scholarship, at least traditional scholarship, can be reduced to arguing over proper classification and proper lines of influence, who influenced who, etc., etc. We'll be dipping into some of that over this course, because these are obviously very important questions and fascinating ones as well. But they add an additional difficulty with Gnosticism, because so many people have meant so many different things about it. So rather than dive into those waters from the get-go, at least in terms of traditional scholarship, I just wanted to tell a tale. The first time I gave a public lecture shortly after graduating undergraduate work at Yale, where I wrote my senior thesis on Gnosticism and Philip K. Dick, I was actually giving a talk about Gnosticism at Philip K. Dick at the New York Open Center. And I had prepared all of my notes, and everything was all lined up, and I was ready to go, and it was only a few minutes before the course, and I realized that I didn't have a handy-dandy definition of Gnosticism. And I'm like, oh my God, what am I going to do? So I grabbed one of the Dick books that I had brought with me, which is his very Gnostic late text, Valis, which is full of wisdom literature and quotations from philosophers and ancient religion. It's a real data-packed wonder ride. If you haven't taken it, I encourage you to do so. And I opened this book randomly, that's right, just to any page. And the first lines that my eyes fell across as I was standing there in front of the people prepared to speak was, "This is Gnosticism. In Gnosticism, man belongs with God against the world and the creator of the world, both of which are crazy, whether they realize it or not." And in some sense, this is as good a definition as we're going to find, which is to say that there is something in man that is connected to, let's call it, a true God, or a true origin, a real source, and that this connection is genuine and possible and transformative, but that it takes place in a fallen world, perhaps a deluded world, or even maybe a cosmic trap, and that this fallen world, or this deluded world, or this cosmic trap has sources behind it. The technical term is a demiurge, or a maker. And one of the fundamental ideas in most Gnostic systems is that there is a difference between the demiurge who created the world, and by the world it really means the cosmos, the material cosmos we're in. There's a difference between this demiurge and the true God who lies beyond this space, but which we still can connect to through the mysteries of Gnosis. Bringing up the term Gnosis in some sense makes our task even more complicated. If trying to identify what the ancient Gnostics were about, let alone what it means to say that a modern person, say a writer like Thomas Pynchon or William Burroughs, is actually a quote-unquote Gnostic, and what that means, that's all difficult enough. But it even gets crazier when you start talking about Gnosis, this experiential knowledge that is at the heart of the Gnostic worldview. As I just mentioned, Gnosis means knowledge, but it's pretty clear from the text that they're not just talking about book knowledge or rational knowledge or rational understanding. Though at the same time it's important to emphasize that Gnosis clearly brought with it some real information about how to handle the cosmic condition that we're in. But it's clear that it's also more than information, that it's something like what we might say in an Eastern tradition is like samadhi or enlightenment. And of course, as with those terms, things get squirrely really fast, so that what Gnosis means becomes a very contested item, particularly today, when people will use the term, and let's say in magicians or contemporary occultists will describe any sort of trance state as a kind of gnosis. It means a sort of experiential, cognitive experience. Certainly intense psychedelic experiences often seem to resemble or have a character of gnosis to them, and people will talk about that. People will also make the connection with Eastern accounts of enlightenment or liberation, and say that really gnosis is just the same word for that kind of experience. I think that it's one of the things that's interesting about studying Gnosticism is that however much you read, however much you understand, however much you get a real handle on the history and the texts and the teachers and the motifs and the images, is that because at the heart of it there's this radical experience that in some sense we can't know, at least while we're in this world of discourse and books and bodies, that we can't quite know, or if we know fleetingly or confusingly or perhaps insanely. That the fact that there is this Gnostic character at the heart of the endeavor to understand what Gnosticism is, it makes it a different kind of search. It means that all of our book reading is ultimately undermined by something outside of that framework, which maybe we can only see the shadow of or sneak up behind. But it charges the work with a little bit more energy than a lot of other kinds of intellectual or scholarly pursuits. It keeps us both humble and also on our toes, if you will, for precisely the kind of magic synchronicity that would have allowed somebody to open a book randomly to any page and find exactly the bit of information, exactly the little tidbit of mystery that they needed at that point. So, even though, in some sense, this question, this mystery of Gnosis lies at the heart of our exploration into Gnosticism, I also want to take a step back and look really hard at some texts. This class, like I think in some ways Gnostic culture in general, is a very textually based one. We'll be doing a fair amount of reading, and I really encourage you to do all the reading. It's only going to be better for that. It's not a crazy amount, but in the need to both have a solid historical and critical understanding of some ancient Gnostic ideas in order to understand how they change and move forward into the modern age, which is what we're doing with most of the lecture after the first few weeks. In order to really do that, you need to read some nice scholarly material, and I've picked accessible stuff that's pretty readable but also very informative. But if you're just reading that stuff, it's dry and boring. It's just like reading a list or a catalog or something. Much more important to me is the direct encounter with texts that crackle with Gnosis, texts like Philip K. Dick's Valis, which we won't be reading, although we will be reading a great, my favorite Philip K. Dick short story, The Electric Ant. And one of the marvelous things about Gnosticism is with that discovery in 1945 of the Nag Hammadi codices in Egypt, we actually had for the first time the opportunity to really look at a large number of original Gnostic texts. There were some before that, the Pistis Sophia, also the Song of the Pearl, which is one of the first week's readings. In fact, probably the first thing I would ask you to read. Those texts did exist before, or were in our hands before Nag Hammadi, but with Nag Hammadi it was a veritable explosion of information, and once these translations got out, they took a while to get out, we were able to just pick the stuff up and dive right in. And both with the readings for the ancient Gnostic part of the course and with the readings later, as I go to sort of look at how did these ideas and patterns of Gnosticism go on and transform in the 20th century as literary people and mystics and psychedelic explorers took up these ideas and motifs and transformed them for our time. As we look at all of those questions, I've really tried to focus on texts that reflect a really kind of incandescent sense of the presence of this Gnosis, which is, again, on the edge of conventional cognition. It seems like it's something you can sort of sneak up with, and sometimes texts can even transmit, and yet you can never quite pin down. So I'm really encouraging you to approach the readings as a kind of encounter as a possibility of a kind of encounter, that texts and the reading of texts and being conscious of how you read aren't just intellectual games, but in fact allow something more mysterious and multidimensional to move through the process of reading, so that an ordinary pulpy science fiction book can suddenly become, just for a moment perhaps, an oracle, a glimmer of the divine. And that theme is at the heart of this text that I just mentioned, the Song of the Pearl. The Song of the Pearl, or the Hymn of the Pearl, as it's sometimes called, was a part of one of these many gospels that and other Christian mystical writings, not necessarily mystical, but Christian writings that existed in that first few centuries after Christ, before it was determined what was legitimate New Testament and what was illegitimate. There were tons of these gospels floating around, many of which were in the Nag Hammadi fightings, and Acts and accounts of infancy and mystery traditions, a lot of cosmologies, sort of rewritings of the sort of beginning of the world. So there's a lot of these kinds of texts that you see in the Bible, but there are many, many different versions of them. And the Hymn of the Pearl comes from the Acts of Thomas, which is one of these apocryphal or not orthodox text that was originally written in Syriac. We don't know who wrote the text. Some people believed it was written by a guy from Syria called Bardason, sort of an interesting character who don't know a lot about, but was an early Christian. In fact, his best friend became the first Christian king in history. And he at one point met a number of Hindu sages, Brahmins, and other religious seekers. So it already gives you a flavor of all the kinds of ideas and practices that were floating around at this point in history as different traditions ran into each other. And of course, the question of where these Gnostic tendencies come from is an extraordinarily difficult and complex question, with scholars arguing about it and many non-scholars weaving quite fanciful tales of the origins of these mysteries. But luckily, these mysteries are also incarnated in texts that we can read. And whether or not Bardacian wrote it, the Song of the Pearl is here for us. It's a short tale. It's extremely charming. It's almost like Le Petit Prince, that marvelous little kids book that at least I loved when I was young. And it tells a very simple story of a prince who leaves his home to go to Egypt to retrieve the pearl that is held by a serpent or a dragon at the bottom of a lake. And once he arrives in Egypt, he, in order to disguise himself so he's not known as a foreigner, takes on their clothes and starts eating their food and forgets who he is and why he's there. But his parents back in his homeland, or wondering where he's about, send him a message. They send him a letter. And this letter finds him in a somewhat mysterious way. It describes it as it takes the form of an eagle. So it's some kind of mysterious letter, but it's still described as a letter. And when he reads this letter, when he's reading a text, when he reads this letter, he remembers who he is. He suddenly remembers that he is the child of these distant royalty, and that he is in this land with a specific mission to retrieve this pearl and bring it home. And so with this new information to guide him, and in fact, as you'll see, the story says that this text follows him along the way, or he actually finds it again later when it's time for him to go home, tells him how to retrieve the pearl from the serpent. Very heavily loaded metaphor once you start thinking about the nature of serpents, and this beautiful image of the pearl as for the mystic self or whatever. That once he has retrieved this pearl, he returns home, going through the difficult lands that lie in between, and finally, when he returns, he meets his parents again, and he puts on his robes, the robes that he had left behind, his true garments, not the garments of the Egyptians. And as he puts on this true garment, it describes that the garment itself quivers with the movements or the flickerings of Gnosis. So even this garment, this kind of tapestry, is woven from mystical knowledge that also took the form of a letter and penetrated this world that he had fallen asleep into in order to wake him up and remind him who he is. So there's a lot of ways to talk about this story and unpack it, and we'll be doing that in the in the forums. I don't want to go into too much of it now, except not so much to talk about the symbolism of the pearl or the serpent or the other world or forgetfulness and awakening of the difficult passageway between worlds, of being an alien or a stranger in a strange land. All of these motifs are very literary motifs, and they're fundamental to the Gnostic ethos or the Gnostic atmosphere. And I think if we get too far away from this basic metaphor, which is again kind of what Philip K. Dick was talking about, where the self and the true God are in alliance, kind of against a fallen or an illusory or a kind of lost world, that's a kind of fundamental vibe that I would like to keep alive as we go through and look at the variety of forms of Gnosis. So we can go through and talk about some of those motifs and some of that symbolism, but the thing I just wanted to emphasize right here, as you are about to embark on 2 months of study that involves mostly reading text and writing text online and listening to some words from a guy talking into a microphone, is how the Song of the Pearl stages this multidimensional encounter with reading. That when the prince who has forgotten himself is lost in the world, or in this particular world, this particular matrix, when he encounters this letter, this message sent from afar, this signal coming from beyond the cosmos, it wakes up something in him. And so the act of reading is also a kind of remembering, not simply recall, as in memory, but remembering, drawing the bits and pieces together, an act of integration that is both conscious, it's informational, but it does its magic on another level. It changes your level, it changes who you are, where you're reading, who is reading. So it's a great story to start off because it can become a metaphor for the very process that you are partaking in by joining in what I hope to be is a very rich and entertaining and illuminating and sometimes a bit dark and disturbing study of Gnosis then and Gnosis now. The main text that we're reading this week is the Gospel of Philip. And though, of course, we don't know who wrote the Gospel of Philip, scholars pretty much identify it with the Valentinian school. You read about Valentinus in the Richard Smoley excerpt from last week. And in many ways, his system is the most psychologically sophisticated of the Gnostic systems that we know about. And he himself was a pretty well-known fellow. I think one of the most interesting facts about him is that while he was from Alexandria, he did spend some time in Rome, and at one point, according to some sources, came pretty close to becoming a bishop of Rome. And this was before the time they had popes. It was still in this early phase when there were a variety of competing descriptions of Christianity that were vying for ascendancy before Orthodoxy really took hold. And Valentinus' system was one of these. So he very much did not see himself as a heretic or an outsider. but very much of a Christian. And in some ways, his writings are a little bit more similar to Orthodox Christianity, though they retain a profound Gnostic core. So the author of the Gospel of Philip was most likely a member or a follower of Valentinus. It's another one of these Gnostic Gospels that's not really very much like a gospel, like the Gospel of Thomas. It's a collection of sayings, which, similar to Thomas, are often curious and odd and Zen-like and marvelous, but are a little bit maybe harder to get into. I actually selected a pretty small number of them for you to read, but I encourage you to poke around and stray. There's actually some very interesting things in there that I did not emphasize in the particular ones that I wanted folks to read. The most interesting general theme of these selections, including many that I didn't select for the reading, is the profound sexual symbolism that you find in here. There's a lot of emphasis on androgyny and on the male-female aspects of God. This is one of the things about Gnosticism that is very different than conventional Christianity, and one of its most interesting and kind of dynamic aspects is the way that it deals with sexuality and sexual symbolism. If you're interested in this topic, which I'm not overly emphasizing in this class, although we'll talk more about it next week, there's a great chapter in Elaine Pagel's book about God the Mother, or God the Father, God the Mother, I think is what it's called, and she talks about the stuff at great detail. But she's really addressing this issue of the idea of God the Father, this patriarchal image of God, which is of course reflected in the Orthodox patriarchy, the patriarchal structure of Orthodox Christianity, where women aren't allowed to speak, or they're separated into the back of the church, or they have to be subservient to their husbands, just as their husbands are subservient to the priests, who are all male, etc., etc. You know the story. That too is not fixed in stone or set out from the beginning of Christianity, and that while Gnosticism's attitude towards women is certainly ambivalent, you may remember there's a line in the Gospel of Thomas about women needing to be like men in order to make it into the kingdom. Nonetheless, it's clear that on a mythological or a symbolic level, that the Gnostics were willing to use positive images of femininity and to actually emphasize a kind of almost a savior-like quality to many female figures. Next week we will meet a figure called Sophia, who's the most interesting of these Gnostic women deities. Though deity is not quite the right word, but this engagement with a more multivalent sense of gender on the level of mythology and on the level of religious symbolism was also reflected in the practice, in the sense that many Gnostic groups had women as leaders. Women were encouraged to become, to be part of the communities, which in many ways reflected their status in at least the more elite levels of the Roman Empire. Again, the Roman Empire in these last few centuries was not unlike our world, and one aspect of this similarity was the relative freedom and autonomy granted to at least more upper-class women. And this was reflected in some ways in some of the Gnostic groups that we know about. Inside the Gospel of Philip, there's also a lot of references to a variety of rites, of rituals, of sacraments. We're familiar with the sacrament of the Eucharist and of baptism, but the Gospel of Philip is also very much emphasizes the sacrament of Chrism, or anointing. That's where the word Christian or Christ comes from, is the idea that Christ is the anointed one, and by this they literally meant an anointing of oil. Just as a side note, there is a small but not ignorable group of folks who believe that it may be the case that there were psychoactive substances in these oils, particularly cannabis, and there are some etymological, linguistic evidence for this inside of the Old Testament, and some pharmacological evidence that a sufficient infusion of cannabis into oil would be able to produce psychoactive effects. As you might guess, this is not exactly trumpeted from the rooftops of theological seminaries across the land, but it is worth noting. But in the Gospel of Philip, the most interesting sacrament that is emphasized time and time again is the bride chamber. I think it's the Greek is the nymphion. And the idea here is that the image or the dynamic of marriage, and particularly the consummation of marriage, becomes at the very least a symbol of the transformation of the seeker as they become a Gnostic, or as they experience this initiatory truth of the sect. And possibly more than that. There possibly was a ritual of a literal bride chamber, and of course, if that's possible, so is it the case that there may have been a sexual dimension to this ritual. Some scholars believe that that's the case, and that the Gospel of Philip actually represents a positive valorization of human sexuality. Others say, no, these are Gnostics after all. They hated the body, they hated the flesh, they weren't into sex. Don't be fooled by the religious symbolism of gender, which is of course widespread in religious writings and never simply means that everybody was having a good old sacred orgy. If we read the Gospel of Philip closely, we'll also see that there is some questioning, even in the text itself, of the very use of religious language and the tendency to read things literally. So I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end of the lecture. One little interesting bit about this potential actual bride chamber, again, these would be followers of Valentinus, is that it occurred in a room, in an actual chamber that was surrounded by mirrors. There's something about that image that very much strikes me. Well, the discussion of these rituals and these rites, which were clearly, especially from a Gnostic perspective, not simply symbolic of the believer's entrance into a new social community, but were at the very least representative of internal transformations, if not actually the transformations themselves. We have to remember that these various Christian groups were finding their way in the same milieu within which pagan mystery religions were gaining in such ascendancy in the antique world, or the world of late antiquity. These mystery religions, which came from different parts of the empire and were in fact to some degree a very important part of empire, which was a kind of globalization, is that, if you were a shopkeeper in Rome in the 2nd century, you would hear about there were these new cults that were coming in from the east, cults of Isis, cults of the mother goddess, cults of Mithras, and that might sound kind of cool, kind of exotic, and they promised little initiatory secrets that you'd find out, and these great experiences, these kind of performative rituals during which you would not only discover information about the cosmos, but actually have presumably some kind of spiritual experience yourself. This was very attractive to many people in the pagan world, and in some ways, particularly early Christianity, mirrored while sort of standing aside to some degree from this process. And so we see this reflected in the Gospel of Philip. Again, not so much in the selections you read, which I had chosen more to emphasize what is to me the kind of core question that we're dealing with, at least this week, is this question of Gnostic experience. This is one of the fundamental things that you're going to find in any account of Gnosticism, however learned or ignorant, is that Gnosticism, in distinction to Orthodox Christianity, places an enormous emphasis on personal experience, not simply in believing, but of actually undergoing or seeing or knowing, which is of course the word gnosis, knowing something about the higher realities. But how do we talk about something like this? How do we think about it? It's very tricky. The whole question of experience itself is very tricky. What does it mean that I can understand your experience, or that I can try to relate my experience in language using these bric-a-brac of words and sounds that brought, that are already in the world when I show up, and yet I'm somehow supposed to organize them in a way that communicates something of my experience. Things get, of course, much more tricky when you start talking about spiritual experience, because A, what does that mean? And B, presumably a lot of these experiences are rather ineffable, in other words, hard to describe. And in fact, if you look at a lot of the records of mystical experience, a lot of times they just keep hitting you over the head with the fact that language fails and that you can't actually get there with language. So certainly when we're coming to try to understand what this might have meant for these people living 2,000 years ago, it gets tricky pretty fast. But at the same time, we're kind of blowing our mission if we leave that alone, or if we sort of just put a frame around it and say, that question we cannot ask. I suspect that all of us here are here partly because we are interested in the question of spiritual experience and how that becomes mirrored and how we ourselves can tap into it. So rather than go into a lot of stuff about comparative mysticism and blah, 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 I thought I would just kind of lay out just a couple of points about this. One is that I think when we talk about spiritual experience, it's really, really important to keep in mind this threefold nature of being that is so crucial to Gnosticism as well as many other systems and ways of thinking about the self at this time in history, definitely including Platonism. Richard Smoley touched on this a little bit in his chapter that we read. But to go over it, in addition to the body, it's not just that there's the body and the soul. There's what you could say the body, the soul, and the spirit. So this interesting difference for us then is the difference between the soul and the spirit. And what I'm going to say here is not so much about the technical, historical definition of that difference, although there'll be some of that, but really more my own personal way of understanding and mapping these realms, because it keeps coming up over and over again, particularly if you look at some of the more modern tendencies of interpreting Gnosticism, particular things that come out of Jung and archetypal psychology, James Hillman. There's a lot of people who have wrestled with this issue of the difference between the soul and the spirit, or between psyche and pneuma, or pneuma. I'm actually not even sure how to pronounce that, whether the P is silent or not. I assume it's silent. The psyche is a little bit easier to understand because we already have that word. We already understand that the psyche is kind of like the personality or the psychology. And you can imagine the psyche is the sort of, it's the realm of archetypes, the realm of different personas, to the degree that, let's say, the ancient Greek gods represent different aspects of personality, of desire and fear and valor and craftiness and trickiness and all of these different aspects of the human psychology. In some sense, that's the realm of the soul, the realm of the psyche. And next week we will see that there's a very specific idea that underlies a lot of Gnosticism about how that psyche comes to be and what that psyche has to do with the structure and the nature of the cosmos, and particularly the question of what happens when you die, or what salvation is. Because in addition, or on top of this psyche, this realm of psyche, the Gnostics imagined that there was a realm of the spirit, something almost alien to this world, a spark from the beyond, from the far God, which somehow managed through all of these very circuitous, somewhat paranoid mythological cosmogonies that the Gnostics created, somehow got embedded in this world of matter and in this world of psyche. There's I think a great, very simple distinction that James Hillman talks about, is that the realm of the spirit, of the pneuma, the pneumatic, is like the mountaintop. It's that classic image of spiritual seeking where you climb to the mountaintop. You go up, and you finally reach the top of the point, and then you can see clear, and you're above it all, and it's all right in front of you, and you have that clear mountain crystalline energy, like the top of the Himalaya or something. But the realm of the soul is a much sort of murkier place. It's the valley of consciousness. It's the place full of hills and dales and murky streams and animals and towns and characters lurking in the forest. It's a more pagan place, if you will, whereas the realm of the spirit is a more transcendent or transpersonal place. And then, of course, we have these different dimensions to us. To oversimplify, you could sort of say that much of shamanism in the shamanic realm seems to take place more in the realm of the psyche, but a psyche intensified to embrace and include the vast diversity of the types of consciousness associated with the planet, with animals, with minerals, with spaces, with ghosts, with ancestors. But the more transpersonal dimensions and paths within human spirituality, Dzogchen or Zen or some forms of Gnostic mysticism, really emphasize a far more kind of abstract, almost limpid, crystalline approach to spiritual experience. So when we start talking about spiritual experiencing, trying to imagine what it might mean, that I think it's important to keep that difference in mind. I think that Gnosticism clearly makes room for the realm of archetypes and the realm of images and the realm of visions. We remember from the hymn of the Pearl the way that the hero returns home, and rather than stripping himself bare of all of the cloaks and all of the things he's worn in order to become this pure spark of the higher kingdom, he actually puts on this visionary garment. It's almost like he puts on the sort of astral body that is appropriate to this new or higher realm. So I think that we should not make too much of that division and say, oh, the Gnostics were only into transcendence. They weren't into more shamanic or visionary mysticism, and because there's a huge amount of this sort of visionary material being produced by different groups around this time, not just Gnostics, but there's a great tradition of Jewish prophetic writings that are very visionary, spookily psychedelic in some places. And so I feel like that what we're sort of asked to do then is not only keep in mind the difficulties of talking about spiritual experience, but also to acknowledge that there is some way that they're reflected in language. But how? One of the other big differences between Orthodox Christianity and Gnostic religion is, on top of this difference between following beliefs and pure experience, is a different relationship to language. Because of course that's what we're doing here. We're reading texts, we're writing posts online, I'm talking, you're listening, we're processing language for the most part in this course. Well, one of the things to say about that is that these differences line up. If from the Orthodox perspective, one of the important things to do, or the way that you enter into the Orthodox Christian world, is to accept a belief, to believe, as they emphasize over and over again, that, let's say, Christ died for our sins, that it's all about the words, not only really meaning what they say, but meaning exactly what the authorities say they say. And that's really important, that the Orthodox view is not only an idea about what it means to be a member of the religion, i.e. a believer, but it also presents a certain idea about language. Of course, Christian ideas about language and biblical writing, etc., are extremely complicated, and there's a lot of diversity, a lot of ambiguity. But at the same time, there is a sense that particularly the Gospels and the biblical writings themselves have a kind of perfection and inerrancy because they are, from God or from the Holy Spirit. That's been more emphasized in modern Christianity, when you have the idea of that the Bible is literally true. That idea of being literally true would not really have meant anything in the ancient world the way it does today. But it's an important indicator that there's something in the Orthodox way that emphasizes a certain view of language. What we find in some of the quotes that, or the sections that I've asked you to read from Gospel of Philip, is a very different model of language, a surprisingly sophisticated one. In the section on names, it says that the names of earthly things are illusory. We stray from the real to the unreal. And these words are not just about objects in this illusory realm that we're stuck in, but religious words: Father, Son, Holy Spirit, life, light, resurrection, church. So it's a really interesting way to sort of undermine or question even religious language itself, even as you're producing religious language. Here we sense some of the special flavor of Gnostic writings, their irony, their self-deconstruction. These are some of the elements that make them very appealing to modern people. In a way, it's almost a contradiction, although maybe not. On the one hand, we are attracted to the fact that Gnostic writings seem to open up the possibility of genuine, individual, personal experience. For people who are jaded and sick of the kind of accretions of conventional religion with its dogmas and beliefs, and when you see all the ways that those things become manipulated, you stir up a strong desire for a form of religion or spirituality that emphasizes personal experience. This is one of the fundamental ethical assumptions and drives of the whole counterculture, whether it's spiritual or not, is this quest for experience, and that in experience, whether it's hedonistic, whether it's drug-related, whether it's sexuality, whether it's yoga and meditation and Tai Chi, that there's an element of experience to the path. And this very much has marked kind of contemporary or New Age or modern spiritualities. There's always a place for experience, even more for belief or ideas, because the beliefs and the ideas are constantly changing. So on the one hand, we're partly attracted to Gnostic writings because they open up and they gesture towards and they speak of this kind of immediate experience, the kinds of things that transform us because we have gone through them, and that many modern people experience certainly through psychedelics, if not through some of the more special experiences that lie on the path of a variety of mystical traditions that are now widely practiced. But if the importance of personal experience is one aspect of what attracts us to Gnosticism, and that Elaine Pagels goes into great detail in on that chapter with some really interesting little factoids, that on the other hand, one of the things that's attractive about Gnostic writings is precisely the self-consciousness they sometimes have, not always, sometimes have about writing itself. There's an element of irony. There's an element of even distrust, even occasionally paranoia, which we'll see next week when we look at some of the ways the Gnostics read against the grain the account of the creation of the world and of paradise in Genesis. So a lot of the particular examples that we're reading this week are parts that emphasize this kind of ambiguity and multivalence of language. Well, why would that be the case? What would be important about letting the reader know that words like Father, Son, Holy Spirit, light, life, resurrection, and church are in some sense illusions? They're unreal, though they refer to the real. Why would you do that? Well, precisely to undermine the tendency to take religious language literally. And of course, we can just look at the 20th century as full of great evidence of why it's a bad idea to take religious language literally. But it doesn't mean to just say, oh, it's a bunch of images, doesn't mean anything. No, no, no. It stages something. This religious language stages something that's very important. Well, what is it if we read the Gospel of Philip? What is this thing that religious language stages? If it's not giving me facts, if it's not giving me things that I just believe are literally true, what is it doing? Well, on one level, and this applies to us presumably almost as much as it does to the people for whom these texts were written, it invites us to engage writing as a continual process of transformation, of coming up with ideas, experiences, linkages, and then undermining them as things move on. Because this dynamic of personal exploration is clearly a very strong dimension of Gnostic experience. One of the things that Pagels talks about, and that the Gnostics were attacked for, is that while they talked a lot about experience, there was very little about how to do it, about what this really meant. Now, that may be because they were keeping things secret. I'm sure that was the case. But I think that it was also that nobody believed that there was one particular way to do it. That on some level, the quest for experience was an individual path, that morality and technique we're all in some sense up for grabs depending on the particular situation. And I think that relativism you will see reflected in the Gospel of Philip, and it very much reflects our own relativism. So by loosening up the literalness of language, there's a kind of invitation for us to go into the act of interpretation, not simply as a dry exercise in trying to figure out what these words mean, or a historical exercise to try to reconstruct who the Gnostics were and what they thought, but that the act of interpretation itself becomes a kind of theater of our own transformation, or our own understanding, our own self-mirroring, our own discovery of the evil within us and of the spark within us, and to sort of finalize this question of inquiry, not finalize it, but to sort of conclude at the moment. I just wanted to read the one of the last bits in the Gospel of Philip, the root of evil, not because we've talked so much about evil, but because it emphasizes this process. And so many of the selections that you will be read really talk about process, that it's about a continual kind of transformation of inquiry into the nature of the situation, even as all the literalistic elements of it change, that I think is really key. Jesus pulled out the root of the whole place, while others only did it partially. As for us, let each one dig down after the root of evil that is within us, and pluck it out from our heart from the root. It will be uprooted if we recognize it. But if we are ignorant of it, it takes root in us and produces fruit in our heart. It masters us. We are its slaves. It takes us captive to make us do what we do not want, and what we do not want, we do not do. It is powerful because we have not recognized it. While it exists, it is active. What I like here is this idea not of defining what exactly evil is, but that we have responsibility to uproot it in ourselves, and that if we ignore it, if we ignore our own particular evil, it takes over. So this is very much a almost psychological process of self-investigation, of self-inquiry, rather than following a moralistic guidebook. And in fact, you'll see that a lot of the moralistic language is actually undermined by the fact that it's not really clear what it means. A lot of times the Gnostic Jesus is asked by his disciples, well, what does this mean? What should we do? What are we going to do? And he throws it back in their face. Where should we stand, they say in another tractate. And he says, stand where you are. So listen where you are. This week is the last week where we'll be looking at traditional, ancient Gnostic texts. And in some ways it's the chewiest piece that we've read yet, because unlike the other texts, which were Gospels or collections of sayings, this is a cosmogony, a creation story, and as is often the case with the Gnostics, or generally the case, that these cosmogonies or cosmologies, structures of the universe, are very complicated, obscure, and very rich with characters and layers of reality, and so can be a bit tough on the head. I chose one to read called On the Origin of the World, but there are many in the Gnostic Bible, and they're quite fun to read, and really the more you read of them, the more they start to make sense, because while each one is different, and there's always different details and different names, and sometimes figures are more good in one and become more not so good in another one, the basic patterns of the stories are rather similar. And so actually the more you read, the more it starts to kind of make sense. So the cosmogonies are really the creation stories are really the place where the Gnostics laid out their mythology, where they named their gods. They created the structure of reality, where they reflected the nature of all the entities that inhabited the world between our physical world and the world of the high God, of the far God, with his aeons. You don't get too much of the aeons in the text we reread we're reading this week. But that's an important idea, which is that along with the sort of highest supreme God, there's sort of a collection of other entities that maybe he's identified with, maybe not, but they tend to be things like his wisdom or his forethought or his omniscience. But they are their own kind of entities that are usually referred to as aeons. So when Aleister Crowley talks about the new aeon, in some sense he's drawing from this idea of a God who is also a kind of form of consciousness or a kind of layer of reality. But most of the action we see here takes place in a lower realm, and it begins with, and it's a little obscure in this one, it's a little clearer in some other Gnostic creation stories, where the Gnostics are facing the same problem that Christians face, or that other monomyths or monotheist kind of groups do, which is how do you explain the origin of evil? Really, one of the great problems in world religion, not just evil in terms of a conscious, malevolent Satanism, but also just badness, things that go wrong, suffering and pain and death, etc. This problem is called theodicy, and the Gnostics had their own twist on it. And they often explained it in this way that you see here, where it's through a kind of frustrated desire from one of the beings in the supreme world, sort of kind of getting out of line and seeking to unite too quickly or too intensely with the Father. So it has that kind of erotic overtone, and it is often the figure Sophia, who appears in complicated and somewhat contradictory ways, is multiplied actually in the text that we read, and I'll mention that a little bit more in a second. But the idea is often that Sophia, out of her great desire to unite with the Father, sort of seeks to do it and kind of breaks the chain of command, and is frustrated and forced out of the high realm because of this action, or the emotions or the psychic energies that have been produced by this action coalesce into the material world. And so in some accounts, the suffering and the pain and the longing and the grief that exist in our realm are partly Sophia's emotions that are bound up in this, what is sometimes called pleasantly, an abortion of matter. So it's almost a kind of a stillbirth or an abortion from out of her desire. There's a little hint of that at the beginning of On the Origin of the World. But what we do get is a nice picture of Yaldabaoth, I think that's how you pronounce it, which is one of the names for the blind, ignorant, and to some extent malevolent God, who is, as we can tell from here, more or less identified with the God of the Old Testament. Right here we have one of those primal Gnostic ideas that is so, almost, funny, and it's kind of table turning on the traditional story, where in the traditional Bible, with the Old and New Testament, the God of the New Testament, the God of Jesus, is the same God as the God of the Old Testament, even though he acts like a pretty different God. The God of the Old Testament is clearly like a sort of irascible, cranky, sometimes, extremely violent, jealous character, fairly different from the one that we get in the New Testament, but the basic sort of mythos of the Bible is that this is one God. Whereas the Gnostics turned this on their head, or at least some Gnostics did, many Gnostics did, and said that the God of the Old Testament, the God we meet in Genesis, the God who expels Adam and Eve from the garden, is in fact not the true God, but is a lower order of being, perhaps malevolent and perhaps simply ignorant. And here we have sort of a depiction of the creation of this being, this master of matter, who in some sense is an offspring of this Sophia figure who has kind of caused this calamity in heaven and created a sort of space in the cosmos that is outside of the boundaries of the light realm, outside the boundaries of the true God. And so one of the things that defines Yaldabaoth is that, or as this character is often known as Samael, which is the blind god. is that he believes he's the only thing around. So it's almost as if once this abortion of matter or this error has been separated from the high God, then any beings who emerge in that world have no idea about this other realm unless they are specifically contacted or somehow see through the veil of their realm. And our demiurge, which is a Greek word that means maker, and Plato's creation myths, which also influence Gnostic ones, use the term demiurge. But our demiurge here is kind of a bumbler, or kind of a fool, or kind of an arrogant idiot. And we're under his reign in some sense, his and his minions, the famous Archons. And that's something else we meet early on in the text, is this kind of elaboration of these various powers, or as they're often called in this particular text, authorities. But they all mean the same thing, the Archons, the rulers of the world, the rulers of our reality, our physical reality, but also to some extent our psychic reality or our mythic reality. As we've already kind of noticed from some comments in last week's thread, the Archons are one of the more fascinating elements of the Gnostic cosmology, because while you can sort of show their relationship to the idea of demons, they're really kind of different characters. They do have a fallen angel quality to them. They are sort of angelic in the sense that they administer different realms of reality, and they exist in a kind of hierarchy that moves through the heavens. In a chapter in Richard Smoley's book that I didn't assign, but I had just been reading, he talked about the way that our now traditional idea of angels as living in a kind of hierarchy of 9 levels of the celestial heavens, the cherubim and the principalities and the powers and the angels and the archangels and the et cetera, seraphim. I don't know them all. But that this basic idea of a stacked hierarchy of powers really descends or evolves from a more malevolent or dark view of these hierarchies of power in the Gnostic cosmologies. You'll see also in the Culiano reading this week, which is a very fascinating reading about what he calls the Platonic space shuttle. And he talks about how the idea of a hierarchy of powers it relates to a model that most of us are going to be more familiar with through astrology. The idea, in one way of describing astrology, is that the different planets are basically gods, and they sort of rule that sort of territory of life or reality or the material world. And they rule it to even the extent of controlling it. These days, we don't have a very fatalistic idea within Western astrology. Usually, it's read very psychologically. So these are about forces inside the self that we can really work through, and it's not a deterministic thing like you're going to die on Tuesday, or you're going to get you're going to get cancer of the stomach, or some nasty fate handed down from the perpetual machinery of karma. But this is really more the way astrology was traditionally understood, that the powers that ruled the heavens, the stars moving through the heavens, were gods who lived in these different layers, so that there was a layer of the moon, and then after that you'd have the layer of Mercury, then the layer of Venus, and the layer of the sun, and it would go through these different layers. In the Culiano piece, you'll see that this ended up influencing people's ideas about what birth and what the afterlife was like, because in some Platonic models that very much influence Gnosticism, there's the idea that we descend from the high realm into the earth, and as we descend into birth, we pass through these different heavens, and these different archons sort of shape us and weave the tapestry of fate, and to some extent our personality, into us as we descend. So if you're born under the sign of Saturn, you're going to be kind of a melancholic, depressive, mopey guy, because on the way down, Saturn was able to kind of, put his mark on you, put his stamp on you. And simultaneously, when we die, we ascend through these different layers of reality, and it's this arduous journey where the Gnostic or the spiritual transcendent aiming person must go through and confront these various nasty folks and either have the secret signs or the magic words, or as it was also brought up in the thread last week, perhaps you can be invisible and they just don't notice you as you head towards the heavens. You can see, if you read on the origin of the world closely, that it's not like the Archons are exactly identified with the planetary powers. The numbers of them are a little confusing. I've read this text a number of times, and I'm still kind of confused of whether there's 6 heavens or 7 heavens or 8 heavens. And usually the idea that there's 7 heavens, and then the 8th heaven is the kind of heaven of the stars that don't move. The lower stars, the planets, which is what they would think of them as moving stars. They move, but then once you get to the 8th heaven, it's all static because it's perfect and nothing changes, and that would be the realm of the higher God, or at least the realm before you get to the realm of the higher God. So while we can't strictly identify the Archons with the astrological powers, it's actually a really good metaphor, because we already kind of have a sense of who the astrological planets are and their relationship to fate, their relationship to necessity, particularly in the older pre-Jungian views of astrology, where you are really sort of at their whim, and that many of the events in your life were completely fated based on the time of your birth, or based on the in any number of other ways in which the astrological powers controlled us. So it's a very interesting model, because unlike demons, who are largely seen as kind of like, doing feisty, nasty things, or purely sort of subvertive, negative force, the Archons kind of have power. They're sort of an administrative, even bureaucratic kind of energy. And so there's lots of metaphoric room that I'm sure we're going to explore this week and in the coming weeks, because many of the readings that I chose that are more modern readings really play with this idea of the Archons, particularly the William S. Burroughs a short bit. You'll see very much how Burroughs was reinterpreting, or at least responding to a similar kind of view of reality. But I always thought the fact that there's some kind of administrative function into the Archons a very powerful metaphor for our modern life. It's like when you get stuck in some kind of bureaucratic wrangle with the phone company. I always feel like I'm sort of like under the thumb of the Archons, who rule the the communication sphere. And in many ways, corporations, or the sort of spirit of corporations, or whatever that sense of entity that corporations possess, for me often feel like a kind of Archon, where it's like they do some useful things, they have their power, but ultimately not really in our best interests. So anyway, once the Archons get set up, we have this gradual, multi-layered cosmogony, or creation story, that is clearly based and frankly parodies the traditional account in Genesis. This is one of the marvelous things about Gnostic writings that make them seem so fresh and modern to our ears, is that we can see the way in which they are consciously responding to and even subverting previously existing texts. So there's a textuality, a consciousness about writing and the nature of text and how text creates reality or creates mythology that they're very much working with, where they actually want to mock the God who in other readings or in other texts is seen as the true God. So there's a lot of commentary and mimicry and parody of the traditional Genesis account on the origin of the world. And if you've read Genesis at all, you'll recognize a number of these lines and ideas. Probably the most radical of these is the notion that the beast, or the snake, the one who encourages Eve and therefore Adam to eat of the knowledge of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, is actually the instructor, is actually the guy who's trying to get them out of the garden. Because of course, if you look at the God of the Garden of Paradise in the Old Testament as being an evil, or at the very least a bumbling, ignorant God, then anything that's going to wake up these poor folks is going to be on the side of light. There's an additional complexity, if this isn't already complex enough, which is that there's often a lot of mirroring and copying inside of these Gnostic creation stories. And it's particularly the copying that again seems weirdly modern to me. I always think of the simulacrum or these sort of parody objects inside Philip K. Dick books, but maybe that's because I discovered Gnosticism through Philip K. Dick. But we see that in a couple of ways in this text. One of these mirrorings is, again, the complexity of the Sophia figure. The higher or good Sophia, who is going to intervene in the abortion of matter in order to liberate the human spirit, is Pistis Sophia, and she has a daughter, Zoe, which means life, or Zoe Sophia, or Sophia Zoe. But there's also a lower Sophia, who is one of the Archons, or the female side of these Archons, who I should have mentioned are androgynous, which itself is kind of an interesting thing. The whole relationship of androgyny and gender is incredibly rich in this creation story, as it is throughout Gnostic literature, and I hope we can go into that more in the threads as well. But in another one of these sort of complex mirrorings or echoes is the nature of Adam. In the text, there's clearly two Adams. There is the heavenly Adam, who is the sort of cosmic man. And the cosmic man is an idea in the realm of the good entities, in the realm of the light entities. Indeed, it's a kind of an archetype of humankind. And you find this idea very much in Kabbalism as well, with the idea of the Adam Kadmon, who's the kind of cosmic man, who's sometimes seen as the body of the universe itself, is this kind of realized higher human. And sometimes an androgynous figure as well. Sometimes Adam Kadmon is actually considered to be not a man, but a man-woman. But that this figure then is copied by the Archons. There's a lot of copying by the Archons, where they see an image of something high. They see an image of Sophia, or they see an image of the higher Adam. And then they, using their lower, tawdry, kind of cut-rate tools, create a copy of these things for various reasons. In the case of Adam, is to actually kind of trap the spirits, to make them feel like that this is the true guy, when he's really essentially a zombie. And so it's quite complicated, because their very attempt to create a false Adam as a way to trick others it turns out to be that they were tricked, really, because by setting in motion the human race, they were creating the vessels that would allow this liberating energy to come in from the higher forces and ultimately redeem creation. Again, it's a complicated story, and I don't want to go in and try to parse every bit of it, because the details always change in different accounts, but that's more or less the story. So you have this marvelous idea of Adam as being this kind of zombie or a golem who is brought to life by this breath from Sophia. So Sophia, the female figure, is really the mediator, almost like a Holy Spirit kind of figure. It is Sophia who is both sort of our realm and still above the realm, and it is she who communicates the liberating energy. She's sort of like a higher Jesus in a way, or at least the pre-Jesus, that just as Jesus actually comes into the world in these Gnostic myths and allows this kind of salvational energy, or a kind of route or a teaching that allows an escape back into the higher realm, the Sophia kind of sets in motion this interaction between the higher and the lower realm, and so she's the one who enlivens the Adam. Another interesting thing on this sort of gender point is the way that Eve is clearly a more evolved, higher and richer being in her creation than Adam. It is Adam who's kind of this bumbling zombie, but Eve from the get-go is this expression of the higher realm inside of the world. And indeed, she at one point seems to actually become the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So it's a very profound idea of the role of Eve, who again kind of mirrors or echoes Sophia in her world bridging and her ability to bring higher wisdom down into this kind of lost wilderness. And when the Archons are trying to they're trying to trick Adam into believing that Eve came out of him, again a parody of the Genesis account of the creation of Eve from Adam's rib. In this account, it's clear that that's a myth, and that if you believe that story, it's only because you bought the disinformation, you bought the lie. In a way, the Gnostics are kind of like conspiracy theorists, where they say, "Oh, all the mainstream people believe the dupe story that that a bunch of Arab terrorists caused 9/11, but we have the real deal, and we'll show you what was actually going on." And in a way, there's something to that energy to these accounts, and one of the ways they're trying to trick Adam is to not only think that Eve was made from him, but to therefore treat her as a slave. And it says that explicitly, treat her as a slave, so that their proper relationship is actually an inverted one, where Eve is really has more spiritual juju than this lower Adam, who is in essence a kind of simulacrum. So that's a sort of fascinating tension there as well. So from all of these accounts, from this account we really get a sense of the kind of dynamism and creative imagination that was going on inside the Gnostics. The fact that each group or sect seemed to produce their own sort of creation story has often been sort of seen as a kind of example of the wild and wacky side of the movement, that it's like they can never really settle on anything. It's like each new guy comes along and comes up with a new system. But from our side, where we are approaching these stories largely as myths with potentially psychological meaning and archetypal meaning, and possibly some genuine spiritual, cosmological mirrorings as well. But the creativity and the tension and the richness and the self-referentiality of these texts make them much more alive, at least for me, than the standard account, which is kind of like the old war horse. Whereas this is the postmodern remix with a lot more energy, a little bit more crazy, a little bit harder to follow, like a Japanese anime or something like that, but a lot more imaginatively engaged and imaginatively rich. I wanted to read one little bit at the end there about how this, in a section called the Blessed Innocent Spirits, and it's just towards the very end. And this, although it's not really clear how this relates to the narrative that we've just read, because it's kind of a slightly different account, at least as I read it, it gives us this fundamental idea about the relationship of spirit and body, or especially the human body, which is that the human body itself is kind of a product of this archonic simulacrum, copying sort of parody of the true high heavenly human body. And so we carry these kind of leaky contraptions, and yet the light has gotten into these. And the light, whether it's brought by Sophia or in this case by these blessed innocent spirits, has sort of entered into us. It's almost like the idea of walk-ins in UFO lore, where you'll meet people who claim that actually they're aliens and who have just sort of entered into a human body and kind of temporarily or permanently asked the human resident to leave. It has that quality to it because the difference between the higher and lower realm is so crisply defined in so many Gnostic accounts. So they're talking about when the blessed ones appeared in the fashioned bodies of the authorities, meaning the fashioned bodies of the Archons, they were envied. And this is often the motivating factor in a lot of the cosmogonies, is envy. The lower figures see the higher figures and they want their beauty or they want their bodies, and so they act in relationship to that. Because of envy, the authorities or the Archons mixed their seed with them to defile them, but they were not able to. Moreover, when the blessed ones appeared in their light, they appeared distinctively, and each one of them from their land revealed their knowledge to the assembly that appeared in the fashioned bodies of destruction. That means us. The assembly was found to have every seed because of the seed of the authorities that was mixed in it. Then the Savior made all of them one. So there's this idea that, and one more line, and the spirits of these appeared, being superior and blessed, but varying in election, and many others are kingless and superior to everyone who was before them. And this is this amazing idea that they talk about how there's 4 races, 4 different combinations of these lower bodies and these higher spirits. There's the 3 levels that we talked about last week, the level of the body, the level of the soul, and the level of the spirit. And it's this tripartite hierarchy that's carried through a lot of Gnostic texts. But here they talk about the 4th race is kingless and perfect. And I don't know if kingless is a phrase you encounter very often in Near Eastern texts. This is the first time I've really noticed it. But it seems like a remarkable way to acknowledge this sense of freedom or liberation that's at the core of the Gnostic project, and which makes it much more interesting than just a body-hating, world-hating religion of asceticism, that there's this really intense sense that all of us below that are under the kings. We are following the Archons. However much we may struggle, we always need to pay our pound of flesh to all of these different kings, these different powers, but that the truly liberated Gnostic is kingless, is free. One might almost say a nomad. So we leave the world of ancient Gnosticism and enter into modernity, our world. And we'll start to look at the different ways that intellectuals, scholars, artists, and writers have come to interpret, claim, and play with Gnostic themes, ideas, and indeed the Gnostic spirit. But before I talk about this week's readings, I wanted to just sum up a little bit of what we have gleaned from looking at a small number of the rather impressive corpus of Gnostic writings. And if you've enjoyed this stuff so far, there's tons of stuff in the Gnostic Bible. Many of them are very interesting, and the more you read, the more you kind of get a sense of where they're coming from. So what can we say about Gnosis? Well, it's clear that they were into something like experience, something like direct perception, or at least something like a mystical understanding, which may have involved information about the secret structure of the world and the hidden passes and hand signs and God knows what one needed in order to make it through the dark realms. But on a more basic level, something about a very pure and unmediated form of spiritual experience and spiritual knowledge. This emphasis on personal experience or immediate experience, really, because there really wasn't personality or personalness quite the same way in the ancient world as there is for us today, where we're so obsessed with the personal. But along with this emphasis on immediate experience came a kind of distrust of more conventional, superficial, and orthodox, or what would come to be orthodox religious forms. The idea that there would be a hierarchy of knowers of texts and words and rites that would mediate between the far God and the high God and our own inner selves was anathema to many Gnostics. And this created a kind of distrust, a kind of rhetoric of suspicion that we find very attractive today, with our own reasons for paranoia and distrust. There is a sense that the inherited story is wrong, or possibly even misinformation. We saw that in the way that the famous Genesis story is kind of turned on its head, so that the serpent becomes a force of the good, awakening Adam and Eve to the reality of their imprisonment in this lower world. But we also found a kind of more general distrust of language, and particularly religious language, as such, because it is seen as a kind of impediment to this experience, which always remains a little bit unclear exactly what they're talking about, but that's as it should be. Again, some people believe that that's purposefully vague, because the whole point is that you have to discover it yourself, and that may be a bit of a modern projection. And as we'll see in the next few weeks, there are many different ways to project modern ideas and modern obsessions onto Gnosticism. That's one of the remarkable things about it, is that it becomes a mirror of many of our own plaints, our own possibilities, our own ways of looking at the world. The distrust that I mentioned also manifests itself in this wonderful mythic figure of the Archon, or the Archons, the rulers, the authorities, this marvelous kind of combination of the fallen angels we are familiar with from medieval and conventional Christian lore, with kind of more of these bumbling, bureaucratic heavies who have a lot of power, but are also sort of occluded and ignorant, and that the wily Gnostic might be able to elude with the proper spirit and the proper luck. And finally, we looked at something which will not come up as much in the rest of the course, although it's a very fascinating topic, and many people have done a lot of interesting work with it, which is the whole gender issue, and the way in which the Gnostic universe is far more richly and dynamically gendered than the conventional or orthodox Christian universe, both in terms of these alchemical images of androgyny, of these tense relationships of desire and rejection between male and female spirits, which is very reminiscent of the mythology of William Blake. For those of you who have read the longer prophetic works, there's a lot of similarity there. And then also, and most importantly, in terms of these powerful female images, both of the Mary Magdalene as this incredible, powerful disciple, and of Sophia as this mediating figure, this suffering savior or suffering mediatrix who stands between us and the higher realm, and is partly responsible for the state of ignorance, but is also partly responsible for the move towards liberation and salvation. So now I want to turn to one of the two readings this week. We have to read Hans Jonas from his very important and justly celebrated book, The Gnostic Religion. Adapted an essay or a chapter from that for the essay that we read about Gnosticism and modern nihilism, or nihilism. And the second reading from René Daumal, a marvelous 20th century French writer that is much less well known than he should be. Almost all of his writings, in fact all of his writings are fascinating. He's one of my favorite literary figures in the 20th century. But first on to Jonas. Jonas's book was the first book about Gnosticism that I read, and I discovered it when I was at Yale studying poetry, because Harold Bloom, who we will read later, a Yale professor of literature, was very interested in the Gnostics and found Jonas's book very powerful. One of the great things about the book, which again, if you're interested in this stuff, you should seek out, is that in addition to summarizing the positions of a lot of Gnostic thinkers, and it was written without much input from the Nag Hammadi findings, so it was really based on Gnostic texts that were already known by scholars before that remarkable finding. But in addition to sort of summarizing a lot of different positions and different sects, there's a really remarkable, wonderful part of the book where Jonas goes and he sort of talks about the imagery and symbolic language of Gnosticism. So he kind of creates a sort of general symbolic map that he finds reflected in many different texts. So even if the details of the doctrine are different, the sensibility and the larger metaphors are very similar. Metaphors like the alien man, metaphors like the call, metaphors like the response, metaphors like sleep or intoxication. These sorts of big themes come up over and over again, and we've already seen them in some of our writings. And in a lot of ways, the Hymn of the Pearl, the Song of the Pearl that we started off with, is a kind of repository of the great Gnostic symbolic images and signifiers, if you will, that get endlessly replayed in different contexts and different fashions by different Gnostic thinkers, but retain a core Gnostic sensibility. And I'll talk a little bit more about one of those major themes in a moment. So at the end of his book, Jonas, who is also a philosopher, wrote a lot of books about philosophy, lays out his cards, which is that one of the reasons that he's so attracted to Gnosticism is that it seems to resonate very deeply and very profoundly with modern existentialism. And indeed, Jonas's existentialist reading of the Gnostics is in some ways the first really rich reading or interpretation of the Gnostics that took them out of a purely religious framework, out of a framework of an interesting footnote in the history of Christianity or in the history of heterodoxy, and really brought them into a form where they were seen as a source of modern meaning, or a source of potential meaning for moderns, for modernity. And he was one of the first people to do that, at least in a scholarly fashion. So what is he on about? Well, he starts off his essay, the essay that we read, talking about Nietzsche and talking about nihilism. I'll say nihilism. This is the great crack that Nietzsche introduces into philosophy, but beyond philosophy, into the basic sense of guidance and of substance that guides the modern person. And the core of Nietzsche's idea is summed up with his famous idea that God is dead. Now that's usually sort of simply or superficially interpreted as meaning that Nietzsche is saying that the Christian God is dead. Well, he is saying that, or at least that the authority of the Christian God, as it had been understood or really experienced by people, was overthrown, was broken, was cracked, was a ruin. Whether you want to invoke Darwin, whether you want to invoke the March of Science, whether you want to invoke capitalism, in a way it doesn't matter. But the deeper idea is not just that the Christian God is dead, it's that the very idea that there is a rational structure of the universe that we can understand given our framework, and that can serve as a foundation for moral or intellectual or spiritual thinking, is gone. It's shattered. There's no there. That in some sense we're making it up as we go along. And a whole bunch of 20th century and 21st century thought devolves or unravels from this essential insight of Nietzsche. So Jonas takes that and he sort of characterizes the universe that follows this insight into nihilism, a universe that's absurd, a universe that's meaningless, a universe that is a sort of empty engine of fate or necessity without any sort of higher grounding or higher principle. And again, you can understand this through the lens of modern science, and to say that science finds no trace of some underlying meaning to the world or the universe, and so all we find is a kind of, series of nested laws which are producing reality and ourselves in this kind of meaningless, repetitive spew through the emptiness of cosmic night. Or you can approach it through the realities of modern history, the fact that that human civilization, believing itself to be having achieved its pinnacle with European society in the late 19th century, has to go through the horrors of World War I, and forced to wake up to the fact that it has no essential moral ground, and in fact is capable of the most heinous forms of meaningless evil and suffering. So in any case, the whole early 20th century sense of the absurdity of the universe, or the absurdity of human experience, and the corresponding alienation from the human situation, becomes very important, very powerful. And Jonas sees this as being eerily similar, and I think in many ways a very appropriate reading, eerily similar to the views of the Gnostics. If we remember that one thing that characterizes the Gnostic is this alienation from the cosmos, meaning the universe as we are participating in it, that there's a higher universe, and that this universe is actually kind of a sham universe, or it's built on lower principles, or it's a creation of ignorance. And so rather than the traditional, if you want to say, pagan experience of being woven into the magical, enchanted matrix of nature within which the human being is balanced and holistically connected to all the forces in the universe, instead of that view, the human being is profoundly alienated from this matrix, which is seen as malevolent, or at least a lower, unpleasant vibe. So in relationship to this experience of the universe as being an absurd, hollow prison, there becomes the possibility of a kind of very difficult form of authenticity. And this term authenticity is very important to the existentialists, it's important to Jonas, and it's important in a certain sense to the Gnostics. Not that they use the term necessarily, but that it becomes a place where the expression of this deeper insight of a personal or of an intimate or an immediate understanding becomes true. Because in some sense, if you're aping somebody else's religious framework, even if those ideas are themselves good or powerful or useful or insightful, if you're simply aping it in a way, you're not being authentic. That the only path out for the Gnostic from this prison is through a kind of authenticity which radically intensifies individual experience. And this is, of course, the place where Jonas is making a leap to existentialism. Because one way of describing existentialism, which, as an aside, I must say, is one of the most important things that emerges in the 20th century, one of the most important philosophical and cultural movements. And it's kind of a shame that from our quote-unquote postmodern eyes that we tend to see existentialism as sort of a silly, kind of dated thing of black turtlenecks and Gitan cigarettes and sort of this ponderous pose and all that kind of thing. And while there's a degree of truth to that, existentialism is definitely a fad. I don't see a way out of the modern condition without at least passing through the existential framework, including its term of authenticity, which of course many more skeptical postmodern types want to reject. But that aside, the existentialist can really be seen as looking at this universe that seems absurd, fatalistic, driven by ridiculous and violent and ignorant human impulses, that the idea that we can reform this through the progress of civilization is completely ridiculous. So what do? Well, for many existentialists, it becomes a form of finding that vehicle or that expression of a kind of higher authenticity. And that's really what Jonas finds most meaningfully resonant, I think, in the Gnostic plight, is that they articulate this sense of yearning for a higher principle, even if they don't necessarily experience it or manifest it. And in a way, that's really the existential plate, is when you are able or willing to remain open to, however you want to see it, higher spiritual forces, the authentic you, the true you, the awakening you, the one who resists lower forms of absurdity, the one who resists society as it is, the one who is committed to a form of spiritual revolt, that process is perhaps hopeless, that there's a forlornness and even a kind, a deep melancholy to this perspective. There's the famous image from Camus of the myth of Sisyphus, where Sisyphus is constantly pushing the rock up the hill and it comes back down, and he's perpetually repeating the same action over and over again, a completely suicidal situation, and yet Camus insists that we must imagine that Sisyphus is happy. And that kind of bleak happiness, or that intensification, Jonas finds as well in the Gnostics, and I think in many ways for good reason. I think that's part of what resonates with us as moderns. I'm not saying that this is the only way to look at the world. In fact, in a lot of ways, that vision of absurdity and horror is a reflection of the particular modern experience of reality, the modern experience of history. And in some ways we're not there anymore. We're in a very different place with multiple views. We're more aware of the multiplicity of perspectives within which some of these enchanted views, these pagan views, these more connected and blissful and intensified views become available as well as one dimension, or as a set of dimensions within this great multiplex of postmodern reality. And yet there's something very true and authentic in that existential view, which I believe is partly why a lot of the Gnostic texts resonate for us. So to approach this kind of question of absurdity and revolt from a different angle, a more ranting angle, a more literary angle, a less philosophical one, and a more spiritual one, I coupled the Jonas reading with some texts by René Daumal, who again I think is one of the real great figures in the first half of the 20th century, and really worth exploring him further. He was born in 1908. And his first sort of claim to fame was he was a member with a couple of other young Turks of a group who called themselves Le Grand Jeu, the Great Game. And they were these snotty, very brilliant, feisty young folks who kind of grew up in the shadow of surrealism. They were younger than the Surrealists, and they took pot shots at the Surrealists, but in many ways they were deeply influenced by the Surrealists. They were kind of like, if the Surrealists were hippies, they were the punks. They had a journal, and they went on, and so it had some of that Surrealist Dada energy, but there was a kind of greater ferocity and at once a crudeness and a sort of spirituality to it that to my ears is more fresh and honest seeming a lot of times than surrealist rhetoric. One of the interesting things that Daumal did as a young man when he was participating in this scene was to do some drug experimentation, as we'll see later on. In fact, we'll read another text by him that has to do with his experiences. And unfortunately for his health, he chose the stern path of solvents. And use solvents to really get to some very, very, very intense psychedelic cosmic places, and wrote some remarkable texts about that, which again we'll look at one of those in a few weeks. But what we have here is a sort of call, a kind of, it almost like a Gnostic call, except that it resembles more the language we're familiar with from the manifesto. You know, there's so many manifestos at this time in history. In the early 20th century, where small groups of artists or politicos thought that if they just sort of said the right thing and ranted in it in the right histrionic fashion, that somehow they would change history. And to some extent they were right, because it was a certain time in history when those kinds of ideas and groups really could make a mark politically as well as aesthetically. And what you see in the Daumal reading is something of that voice, that kind of hysterical, intense, passionate, earnest, but also self-mocking voice of the of the manifesto person, except applied to a kind of spirituality that I feel is very much in accord with a lot of Gnosticism. The most important link we'll see is through the metaphor of awakening, of sleep and awakening. These are one of the great metaphors that Jonas identifies when he talks about Gnostic imagery and symbolism in his cool book. The image of sleep and of awakening, the idea that in the world we are intoxicated or we are asleep, and that the Savior or the call or the voice comes and awakens us and we remember who we are. Again, this basic symbol myth is in the Hymn of the Pearl, where the prince eats of the food. You know, they always say, if you ever see the fairies, don't eat the food they give you. Well, the prince in the Hymn of the Pearl eats the food, he eats the fairy cakes, and essentially goes to sleep, or at least becomes intoxicated, and certainly becomes forgetful. So there's this basic sense of sleep, as a metaphor for the world, but also a metaphor for our own deluded consciousness. I'm hoping I marked this one passage that Jonas points out that I'm going to read. This is from the Gospel of Truth. What then is that which he desires man to think? He's talking about the Savior. This, I am as the shadows and phantoms of the night. When the light of dawn appears, then this man understands that the terror which had seized upon him was nothing. As long as ignorance inspired them with terror and confusion, and left them unstable, torn, and divided, there were many illusions by which they were haunted, and empty fictions, as if they were sunk in sleep, and as if they found themselves a prey to troubled dreams. Either they are fleeing somewhere, or are driven ineffectually to pursue others, or they find themselves involved in brawls, giving blows or receiving blows, or they are falling from great heights, until the moment when those who are passing through all these things wake up. Then those who have been experiencing all these confusions suddenly see nothing, for they are nothing, namely phantasmagoria of this kind. It's a simple idea in a way, and one that you find in many religious metaphors and myths of the world over. Yet I think it's posed with a certain extra ferocity here. And for Domal, this idea that we are fundamentally asleep and that awakening requires a great and continual act of consciousness is also drawing off the work of Gurdjieff. I'm sure some of you have read or been exposed to some Gurdjieffian ideas. And again, for Gurdjieff, the metaphor of sleep and awakening is one of the most important metaphors. But I don't want to get into Gurdjieff. What I want to talk about is a particular twist that Domal puts on it that you will see in his remarkable writing. I think that you'll find this very stimulating. His idea is that consciousness, the consciousness that is awakening, or that awakening gets going, is purely negative. By negative, it doesn't mean it's a bummer or it's pessimistic or cynical. It means negative in a more philosophical sense, which is essentially not that. I am not that. I am not that. That comes up in some forms of Hindu mysticism as well. Sometimes they say, I am that, I am that, I am that. Sometimes say, I'm not that, I'm not that, I'm not that. And for Domal, it was, I am not that. That any content, any state, any concept, any experience even, was a kind of occlusion, a kind of sleep. And that the act of awakening is consciousness waking up to its not being that state. And that's it. It's a continual process of what he calls suicide, of dying to the content of whatever experience, whatever concept, whatever vision, or whatever idea is laid before you. Well, it's a pretty ferocious path. I think we can see it. It's admirable. Keep it up. Rene, he did sort of keep it up, and he became more spiritual as he aged. He got interested in Hindu metaphysics. He learned Sanskrit. He started to translate Hindu texts, and he wrote a remarkable book called Mount Analog. If any of you have seen the Jodorowsky movie, The Holy Mountain, it's loosely based on Mount Analog, which was unfinished, but still a remarkable reading and highly, highly worthwhile. It's one of my favorite spiritual books from the 20th century. So what you have with this sort of sense is not just this very kind of grim idea of awakening, but also the way that he expresses it, and you'll see that in the second part of the reading, is so expressive of the spirit of revolt, of youthful revolt. When I mentioned the punks earlier, I wasn't kidding. There's this quality of intense rejection, a kind of nihilistic glee in the destruction of existing forms that he expresses with remarkable joy and power. It's continued to be an important part of youth culture, through the 50s, through the 60s, through the 70s. It's something that we probably all can resonate with on one level or another. This spirit of uncorked revolt. But it's not simply revolt for the sake of changing. It's not revolt in the service of a political ideology or even really an aesthetic ideology. It's revolt in the service of awakening. But this very kind of audacious and spare vision of awakening that's barely spiritual, as we usually use the term, and yet profoundly transformative. And the final thing to think about, again, is just to remember and remark on the great difference that this path that Domal is kind of gesturing, and that I think that the Gnostics, as Jonas saw, very much articulated as well, which is a path not of holistic fusion, not of integration, although perhaps it is a higher integration, but it certainly begins with radical separation, a radical separation between self, or the spark, or the I, or consciousness, and its context, the world, the body, thought, political ideas, perception itself. And again, I don't think you can exactly live in this separation, and I certainly don't think that it has the whole story. But I also think that it's a remarkably powerful passage, and that both of the authors this week really kind of help lead you through that particular passage. This week we'll be turning to look at 3 different literary authors of the 20th century, all of whom could loosely be said to have Gnostic tendencies, at least in the text that we will read. Last week we read the philosopher Hans Jonas, talking about the relationship between Gnosticism and nihilism, the problem of nihilism, and the existential response to the problem of nihilism. This idea in a nutshell being that the world has no meaning, or at least no objective order of meaning, and this absence of meaning renders it absurd. And this absurdity, and facing this absurdity, becomes the fundamental plight of modern man, and existentialism becomes a response to this. And as we saw, Jonas connected this sense of alienation with a Gnostic experience of the world as a fallen or deluded trap. And though he saw that their solutions were very different, the connection between this modern sensibility and Gnosticism, ancient Gnosticism, remains a fairly strong one in a lot of people's heads. The other text we read last week by René Domal was, if you will, a sort of literary and philosophical expression of revolt in relationship to this sense of absurdity, a call to awaken, not necessarily to a Gnostic experience of the supernal light, but at least a sort of uprising of consciousness away from the sleep of matter and the sleep of ordinary civilization. So in that sense, it still resonates with the fundamental symbols and images of the Hymn of the Pearl and other ancient Gnostic texts. The 3 authors we're reading this week similarly respond to this issue. All of them deal with issues of absurdity, the absurdity of modern life, or rather the modern mind, the sense of the cosmos as being an irrational, absurd, or constricting trap in some cases, and problematize the question of how to escape even further than Domal did. And this makes them less assured even than the most pessimistic Gnostics, because it's not clear from any of their writings if there really is anything like a way out, or at least a way out that doesn't resemble in many ways a kind of madness. Now, before talking about these 3 kind of marvelous texts or writing by these marvelous writers, it's important to acknowledge that the act of describing a modern literary author as Gnostic is a tried and true practice by critics and scholars and literary freaks. Pretty much, almost any vaguely edgy guy or gal that you can think of has been named Gnostic at one point, from William Blake to Baudelaire to Thomas Pynchon, Philip K. Dick, Doris Lessing, Schleiermacher. The list goes on and on and on. Artists and writers and philosophers who have been accused or have been revealed to be in some sense Gnostic. Now, this shouldn't surprise us because we've already seen how varied and rich and even contradictory Gnosticism can be, but that doesn't quite explain why there is this sort of urge to declaim modern writers as being connected in some way with this ancient lineage. And I think there are two main reasons for this. One is pointed out by Richard Smoley in his book Forbidden Faith, where he says that one of the things that unites most, if not all, of these modern authors who get labeled as Gnostic is the quality of revolt in their work. There's an intense sense of rejection and of a revolutionary desire to renew that reminds us of the ancient Gnostic relationship with the demiurge and the whole order of the cosmos that was organized by the Archons. Just to briefly recapitulate, unlike most faiths which see in the structure of the cosmos, of the world, and of the heavens, a kind of sign of God's goodness or the organization or harmony, ultimate harmony of the Godhead, the Gnostics instead saw it as kind of as a broken or imprisoning force, not a reflection of the true God at all. So they have this anti-cosmic sense, which in some ways express itself politically as a rejection of worldly authority, whether religious authority or even in some sense political authority, because the figure of the king comes up in a number of Gnostic writings as being something to avoid or to get out from under. And this sense of political and religious revolt, revolt against conventional Christian orthodoxy, revolt against the conventional organization of society, revolt against ideas of the body, etc., etc. This is a very strong impulse in the modern consciousness. Going back to the French Revolution as sort of the ultimate historical example, or at least the historical initiation of a rhetoric and culture of revolt, which then goes on and continues to express itself throughout the 19th century with Romanticism and well into the 20th century, and to some degree today, although I think things get a bit muddier for us confused postmodern folks. We can look back even at the most nihilistic and despairing mid-20th century existential writers and see that there's a kind of naivete about them as well, in their sense of the clarity of their purpose and even the clarity of the absurdity of the world. That said, revolt is one of the characteristics that when we find in a modern writer, we often think of, here's sort of a Gnostic energy expressing itself. And the other main reason, I believe, is simply that we have a desire to both acknowledge and deconstruct our tradition. That rather than though there's a lot of lip service to wiping the slate clean and being fully modern, there's something also very attractive about the idea that our own modernity is rooted in a traditional source. It's just that this traditional source happens to carry with it an anti-traditional flavor that we in turn can associate with our own modernity. The idea, once again, being that in Gnosticism we see, unlike almost anything else in the ancient world, a reflection of these modern problems of anomie, of alienation, a complex and critical relationship with texts and with authority. So it's almost like we see forefathers. And there's something comforting to that, even if it also underlies the fundamental sense of being displaced or being exiled within human experience. But there's also a kind of continuity in that exile that ties us in with the sort of secret history behind conventional Christian ideas of the origins of Western consciousness and Western ethics. So let's see, talking about ethics, perhaps the first author we'll turn to is Franz Kafka. And what we have here is a collection of a few of his most famous parables. We all know the phrase Kafkaesque. It's one of the most common things to describe something that in some ways we can recognize through Gnostic lenses does have a traditional flavor of the Archons and of their universe. This world of the Kafkaesque is sort of the nightmare bureaucracy where you're inside of a labyrinth of power, except that none of the people really seem to have any power and nobody really knows what's going on. It's kind of confusing, but it's a trap, and the true power is held always by some shadowy force that you're never going to be able to understand or get to or really ever be able to ground. And so in a way, Kafka, more than almost anyone, expresses a sort of spiritual experience of modern alienation, and particularly in its relationship with authority, political authority, and the sort of patriarchal inheritance of the West. Kafka's own father was a raging asshole and really traumatized the poor guy. He clearly never really got over it. And his wrestling with authority and with figures of the father gives, in some sense, his writings a less than purely Gnostic character, because Kafka is so obsessed and enmeshed in networks of guilt and of judgment. And if we remember, this is one of the things that really sets the bulk of Gnostics apart from their more orthodox brethren, particularly as orthodoxy evolves following Augustine and the grasping onto the idea of original sin as being a fundamental explanation for the evils of the world and the evils of mankind. Inside that orthodox framework, guilt makes sense because we blew it, or Adam blew it in our stead. He erred, and we are all suffering the consequences of his guilt, including carrying with us a kind of guilty conscience. And so that guilt is in relationship to this orthodox sense of religious authority. And there's many ways in which Judaism, even as it ignores the Christian idea, still draws from a similar idea that God holds a law. We have strayed from that law, and that we know this in ourselves as guilt, which impels us hopefully to get back on track, to get right with God. And this sensibility is very much a part of Kafka, and it kind of overlays and interweaves with this more Gnostic, highly modernist sense of the absurdity of the cosmos and the absurdity of authority and the absurdity of the law. So what we see in the handful of parables here are some takeoffs on some of these ideas. I want to just touch on them really briefly. Inside the imperial message, we have, if you will, a kind of ironic modernist revision of one element of the Hymn of the Pearl. We keep returning to the Hymn of the Pearl as kind of the fundamental symbolic matrix of the Gnostic experience. And in the hymn, the king and queen, the rulers of the true heaven, send to their prince, their son, who is in the dark lands in Egypt with his quest to recover the pearl. He's forgotten himself, and so they send him this message. And the idea of a messenger who can make it through the chaotic lands in between in order to reach its recipient and establish that connection which reawakens the soul to its true purpose and ultimately its true homecoming. Well, in the imperial message, we have a version of that. The dying king gives a message to his greatest messenger for you. That's right, you, listening to this right now. And this messenger has the sun emblazoned on their outfit as they go to heroically deliver this message to you. You can imagine that this message lets you know that all your suffering is worthwhile, or that God is keeping track of all your good moves, or that you really are a good person after all, or whatever it might be. But as we soon see in the short parable, there's no way that this messenger is ever going to be able to reach you because of the sheer complexity of the halls of the kingdom, of the area where the king lives. We never even see the messenger get outside into the world or into the main city, let alone get to the country or to the other city where you live. So instead, we have this sense of the structure of the cosmos being not only infinitely complex, but sort of recursive and reiterative like a Borgesian labyrinth, a labyrinth essentially, and that even the message can't make it through. There's too much noise on the line. So even if that message is there for you, you're never going to hear it. And that not only kind of expresses a certain forlornness and absurdity about the human condition, about never getting that message, but it also reminds us again of that fundamentally important aspect of the Gnostic view of the world, and particularly of the evil or the difficulty of the world is actually probably a better way of thinking about it, at least in these terms, which is that the problem with the world is structural. It's not because Adam screwed up. It's not because we are guilty of blowing it in an otherwise beautiful world. The Gnostic impulse, in contrast, and this is one of the most important differences to orthodoxy, is that the structure of the universe, of the cosmos itself, which we are not responsible for, the structure of the cosmos itself is flawed, or there's a crack in it, or a gap, or an error. Like there's an error message in the coding of reality, and no matter what we do, we're going to keep encountering the reflections of that, or the outcomes of that. We see a version of this as well in the Kafka, the next Kafka parable, which is about from Paradise, where once again we have this emphasis on the kind of structural problem in the universe, and particularly a kind of deadlock. I want to read one paragraph from here about the nature of man. After we have been ejected from paradise for eating the tree of knowledge. He is a free and secure citizen of the world, for he is fettered to a chain which is long enough to give him the freedom of all earthly space, and yet only so long that nothing can drag him past the frontiers of the world. But simultaneously he is a free and secure citizen of heaven as well, for he is also fettered by a similarly designed heavenly chain. So that if he heads, say, for the earth, his heavenly collar throttles him. And if he heads for heaven, his earthly one does the same. And yet all the possibilities are his, and he feels it. More, he actually refuses to account for the deadlock by an error in the original fettering. So here's a beautiful, tangled, and marvelous depiction or allegory of our condition, where the simultaneous sense of freedom and entrapment are bound together, where it would almost be nice if we were just purely entrapped, but instead there's this freedom to move, the freedom to move through earthly space, the freedom to know something of heaven, and yet we are structurally bound to be perennially stuck between these poles. There's no way of resolving the issue, and the word deadlock is incredibly important here. To my mind, one of the most, sobering and yet illuminating insights that one can have about one's own life, one's experience, the nature of the world, is to start to recognize the way in which things that look like problems to be solved are actually deadlocks. There's no way to resolve them because they are in the nature of the place. They're in the nature of the experience of being human, or being in a capitalist society, or being in a body, deigned to die. That all of these situations, the human condition, produces a whole set of deadlocks. But because it's so frustrating and kind of, potentially depressing to acknowledge the irresolvable nature of these deadlocks, that we tell a lot of stories about how we can solve problems that we really can't, and so we actually magnify our suffering in a lot of ways. And Kafka's talking about that too. He's talking about the way that even though we are bound by these heavenly and earthly collars to not be able to move or embrace fully one or the other, we're not able to return to the innocence of the animal, we're not able to act in the grace of a God. And yet all possibilities are his. That sense of the possible, of being burdened with freedom, which is a very important existential idea. That freedom is a kind of terror as well. That even though it's something we all say we seek, and sometimes we truly seek, that to truly confront the openness of the universe, or the openness of possibility, requires great courage. and can be quite frightening as well. And here we had that sense of, yes, the possibilities are ours, so much so that we can't acknowledge the deadlock. We can't acknowledge the deadlock that lies in the error of the original fettering. So here's, I think, a very beautiful and much more accessible way of understanding a little, or describing a little bit of this Gnostic experience of the cosmos itself, or at least our role in it, our place in it, as sort of fundamentally stuck between these poles. And of course, there's a lot of humor in this as well. Kafka can be incredibly funny. A lot of existentialism is really funny. And it's often more deep and satisfying humor than the kind of, infinite mirror chambers of self-referential postmodern humor that we see so much of now, because it's more earnest and more earned in a lot of ways. But we really see this kind of sense of being trapped in a way, and we are also trapped ethically or morally, as Kafka sees it, because we know good and evil from the knowledge of the tree. We know the difference of good and evil, and not only do we know it, but we are called to actually attempt to live in relationship to our knowledge of good and evil, and yet we are constitutionally unable to do so. We are constitutionally unable to live up to our perceptions of the good and evil in the world. Therefore, we are in a state of potentially constant guilt, which I would say is one way that we experience this deadlock in Kafka, or at least a despairing, or perhaps simply cynical view of human experience. And you can definitely see this in many people as they age. When they're youthful, they have ideals. They believe that the ideals that we can see with our ethics and our heart can be realized in life, and as they go forward, they're frustrated. They see how the world itself is structured to undermine these attempts, and they often become more bitter and pessimistic as they get older. But here we're seeing that kind of very sort of banal observation on a slightly larger and more mythic plane. The last Kafka piece, Before the Laws, is his most famous parable and one of his most famous bits of writing, but I'm going to hold off on that and talk about it at the end. Another text we have is To Have Done with the Judgment of God by Antonin Artaud. This was originally a radio play that Artaud recorded but wasn't aired until many decades later. He recorded it in 1947, a few months or a month before he died. So it's the last work of his life. Complex, rich guy with an amazing history in relationship to esotericism, to theater, to the aesthetics of absurdity, and this piece touches on a lot of this stuff. By the point he made this, he had already spent a lot of time in psychiatric wards through most of World War II, receiving electroshock therapy and all sorts of other really nasty techniques to try to cure him of what were clearly insane, or what most of us would agree were insane behaviors and problems that he dealt with. And in this we see a kind of marvelous and in some ways disturbingly prophetic view of the post-war world, and you can almost see it as being a kind of figure who is roughly contemporaneous with René Daumal, growing up under the influence of the Surrealists and of Dada, reacting to the horrors of World War I, really confronting the just meaningless bizarreness of the early 20th century with a sensibility of revolt. And he begins with this amazing kind of prophetic view of America as the soulless machine of soldiers. And this was, at a time when a lot of people were thinking America was probably America's highest point of, thumbs up in world history. Right after World War II, we're doing the Marshall Plan, we're constructing a post-war world that doesn't have fascism, et cetera, et cetera. But Artaud sees something much darker in that. And he contrasts that with these rituals and rites from northern Mexico in the, I believe in the 30s. He went to visit the Tarahumara Indians in northern Mexico, who are peyote munching Indians not so far away from the Huichol, who are better known for their peyote munching. He wrote a marvelous text about this, which is well worth reading. And we really see these bizarre rituals, which are not at all anthropologically coherent, but still very beautiful, as sort of upwellings of an older way of being in the world and an older way of acknowledging the deep and dark mysteries of body and the earth. But it's after that he really gets rolling, and he has that great line about where it smells of shit, it smells of being, and basically saying that being is part of being in a body. And this whole sense of the body that he expresses here is very complicated, because it's not simply that the body's good or the body's bad, which would be sort of an easy Gnostic dualism, but it's more that we pay for existence with this body of shit and this body of decay, of decaying meat. And yet, in the end, he's really affirming the body as the place of experience, of true being, as opposed to this sort of chillier world. And let's see, where's a good quote here? Yeah, this is it. So, no one will believe me, and I can see the public shrugging its shoulders, but the so-called Christ is none other than he who in the presence of the crab-louse god consented to live without a body, while an army of men descended from a cross to which God thought he had long since nailed them, has revolted, and armed with steel, with blood, with fire, and with bones, advances, reviling the invisible, to have done with God's judgment. So here Artaud, I think, is going a step farther than what we see with Kafka, where Kafka is sort of saying that the law of God is infinitely impenetrable and something that we can never realize, but we can never really escape from. And Artaud's note of revolt is much stronger, much stronger. He's trying to actually escape the shadow of this lawfulness, this organization, and he invokes this absurd Christ who, as some Gnostics believe, lived without a body, like he didn't actually experience or undergo the suffering that we all share as being embodied, and in fact ends up revolting against this this more shadowy God who, if he is a being, he's shit, and if he doesn't shit, isn't a being and doesn't exist. So we see these similarities with the kind of Domal, this French sense of intense anti-Catholic rejection of the world, this idea that consciousness is nothingness, and all of it makes room for a sense of the body. And he even says it quite clearly at one point, this sort of idea that to get out, it's the presence of bodily suffering that offers a kind of experience of escape. So it's a very kind of rich and complex traversal over images of body and escape, and it's driven by this sense of revolt, of spiritual revolt. A revolt not against religion or spirituality as such, because Artaud was very influenced by esotericism, fascinated by it even as he rejects it, but also that there is a spirituality of revolt, and that it is through the body, that it's not simply the body as a trap or the body as a sort of bulwark against the delusions of religion, but rather that the body itself, the explosions of the body, even the farts of the body, are an affirmation of a spirit that is outside of the organizations of God. And finally, we end with this important little image that attains a lot of significance in later philosophy, and particularly the philosophy of Gilles Deleuze. Some of you probably have heard of or read Deleuze and Guattari, the books Anti-Oedipus or 1,000 Plateaus. And these guys are really the most entertaining and bizarre and psychedelic and prophetic of any of the post-structuralist writers that were sort of popular for a few decades, along with Foucault and Derrida and these guys. But if you're going to spend time with any of them, please spend it with Deleuze. And one of the ideas that Deleuze and Guattari develop is the idea of the body without organs. And at the very end of To Have Done with the Judgment of God, Artaud brings up this image, and in fact this is where the image comes from. When you will have made him a body without organs, then you will have delivered him from all his automatic reactions and restored him to his true freedom. So it's the idea that when the body is organized, that is when it's following its kind of structural law, then we are trapped in our automatic reactions, in the robot of Gurdjieff. But it's through disorganizing or deorganizing this body, turning it into what Deleuze and Guattari call a plane of immanence, that we are able to generate this sort of true freedom, as opposed to God, who always has organs or is organized. Finally, I'll just touch on the Burroughs, the very short Burroughs essay, where we see some of these sensibilities changing a little bit into the fully post-war world. And we find this marvelous, marvelous sense of a connection between the rhetoric of the Archons, the powers behind things, the conspiracy behind reality, and connecting it not only with the new order of capitalism, of boards and syndicates, but also, most importantly, with language. We already see some of that with Artaud, that part of the way to have done with the judgment of God is to avoid conventional uses of language, and he uses these made-up words and glossolalia and caca and coco and all these weird words, partly as a way to signify this spirit of revolt. In Burroughs, you have an even more explicit, almost metaphysics about this, where it's the word, and that nice connection between word and world is really important, that he starts off this section from Nova Express. It's the word that imprisons us in time, and that sense of being in time and being in body as a kind of prison. I mean, you get this sort of Gnostic disgust of the body very strongly in some of Burroughs, even as he, in other ways, is clearly enjoying the body. Here you really get that sense of how language and the organization of language, the structures of language, imprison us in time. And one of the ways they do it is through this sort of, conventional sense about the goodness of being in a body, the Garden of Delights. Love, 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 and slop buckets, he mocks this perspective. And here we really have a strong disavowal of the joys of the body, not because that the pleasure itself is wrong. This isn't that kind of ascetic view of the body as being a sack of shit that pretends to be a delicious bonbon or something. Instead, it's the sense that all of these good things of life have been colonized by the Archons. And this is one of those modern perspectives that I think is really important to wrestle with, and a very difficult one, is that it's not that the basic pleasures and enjoyments of life, family and food and sex and cruising around on a sunny day, vacationing, whatever. There's not something inherently evil about that. And yet one becomes aware at some point of how all of these natural goods are infected and reconstructed and organized and controlled is probably the darkest element of it, by these far more nefarious powers who are not interested in maintaining the order of life, or interested in maintaining the order of life only insofar as it allows them to control and manipulate. So then what do? Then you're stuck. You want the goodies, but you realize the goodies are completely embedded in all of these systems. And here you have Burroughs sort of, kind of like Daumal in some ways, offering a stern way out. He contrasts this Garden of Delights world, which he calls a terminal sewer, with the cold, windy, bodiless rock. It's a very beautiful image of this sort of spiritual transcendence, not in a fluffy, new age, gushy way, but rather in that sense that I talked about, in the difference between the spirit and the soul, where there's something cold and hard and impersonal about the spirit, the spark that awakens in the midst of the dream of matter, here rendered as a cold, windy, and bodiless rock. And at the end, we really hear the echo of Daumal when when Burroughs talks about the combination of total austerity and total resistance. But it's so strong, it's so too much, it's so where we don't really exactly live. And, well, I've gone on enough, but I just have to say a little bit about Before the Law, the more Kafkaesque irresolution of this problem, one with less of that intensity, that nihilistic intensity of absolute austerity and total resistance. Instead, we have another image in Before the Law of another labyrinth, where the fellow shows up, he wants to enter the realm of the law, and he's told that by the doorkeeper that he can't enter yet, but maybe he can enter at some point. And he peeks through and he can't really see, and the doorkeeper lets him know that behind the door that he could never, even if he got past this doorkeeper, he wouldn't be able to make it, because there's just a whole labyrinth of layers of this cosmos, each one guarded by ever more fearsome doorkeepers. Well, this is a perfect, beautiful modern expression of the Gnostic sense of the nature of the other world, of the Archon world, where, let's say, after you die, you have to pass by all these gatekeepers, and you have to know the secret hand signs, because they're fearsome rulers of these layers of the heavens. We also see this very strongly in Kabbalistic, or not Kabbalistic, early Jewish mysticism, really before the Kabbalah develops, Merkaba mysticism, from around the same time as a lot of Gnostic writings, where you have these visionaries who go on journeys to the heavens. Some of them are extremely psychedelic, and I've mentioned them before. And that's the same kind of thing you see there, where they'll be encountering these various figures who will challenge them, and then they pass into deeper and higher levels of the heavens. And here we have that same sense of the infinite complexity of the world. And finally, there's sort of a resolution, which you haven't read. I think I'll just let you discover this tale yourself, because like the Emperor's Message, and really in some sense like all of Gnostic writings and all the writings we're reading, in some sense it only really means anything if you realize that it's written not in general, but for you. Poesis, which is a fancy Greek word for poetry, which really means making or creating. And I start off with a reading from Harold Bloom. And Harold Bloom is a character I first encountered when I studied literature at Yale, where he was one of the great literary professors there. And though I never took his courses directly, I saw him give a lot of lectures, and a lot of the professors I did take were very influenced by him. And even though by that point in my life I had already been interested in the occult and mysticism and spirituality for a number of years, this was the context where I first discovered Gnosticism, not in a study of religion per se, but in Harold Bloom's rather unique reading of Gnosticism. And that's what really interests me in this course, or in this particular talk, is how Bloom, along with two of the other authors we'll read, June Singer and a fellow named Erik Wilson, attempt to sort of use Gnosticism and reread it in an essentially secular guise. If 2 weeks ago we saw some modern philosophers find echoes of existentialism and other modern issues in Gnosticism, and last week we saw how some literary authors, sometimes coming from their own perspectives that had nothing to do with the ancient Near East, stumbled upon very similar archetypes and symbols and strategies that resonate with Gnostic approaches, and indeed in some sense permeate modern literature and certainly its more rebellious tendencies. And this week we're looking a little bit more at more official languages of modernity, particularly the language of poetry, the language of reading, the language of psychology, in particular with the other two texts, and showing how they too attempt to sort of rewrite or assimilate aspects of Gnosticism in order to make this old way of looking at the world alive again, and inevitably distorting it a little bit along the way. But that distortion, at least for Harold Bloom, is always part of the picture. one important idea of his that will help you go through this, what I think is really a marvelous little essay that begins his book, Agon, which is one of the first places I read about Gnosticism, is his idea of the anxiety of influence. Basically, Bloom's vision of poetry in particular is an almost Freudian battle between sons and fathers, because of course most of them are male, although he applies the anxiety to female writers as well. The idea is basically that there are strong poets and weak poets, and that what happens when a strong poet of a younger generation comes into their own voice, they must struggle with the anxiety of being overly influenced by the strong poets of a previous generation. And in order to come into their own strength, to their own originality, they must not only struggle, but actually misread or misinterpret the strong poetic voices of the previous generation. The example that Richard Smoley points out in his book about Gnosticism, when he talks about Harold Bloom briefly, is William Blake's famous line that Milton was of the devil's party without knowing it. Because, of course, Milton himself, the great religious poet who wrote Paradise Lost, would never have considered himself part of the devil's party. And yet William Blake, coming later, struggling with his own anxiety of influence, one of his poems is called Milton, wants to sort of recast or reread, or in Bloom's terms, misread his poetic forebear, and so assimilates him to the position of rebellion, one that Milton himself would certainly not have taken. So what Bloom does then is to apply this idea of a creative struggle to find an originality in relationship with previous powers as a model of spirituality, or at least visionary literature, as well as poetic literature. One of the great things about this essay is it does a very nice, quick job of summarizing some of the interesting, deep history of Platonism, because of course as we've noticed already, that in many ways ancient Gnosticism is a kind of mutation of Platonism, of the philosophy of Plato, or rather a Platonic reading of biblical materials. And one of the core ideas in this Platonic tradition is, of course, that there is a kind of spark or a kind of higher soul that is not of the world of matter, that it has something to do with reason, and that through reason we can perceive the ideal world of forms, which we only see reflected in the dirty entropic mud of material reality. And what Bloom reminds us is that behind this idea, this Platonic idea, is an older tradition of the detachable occult self, the self that is not identified with what he calls the psyche, or the more ordinary personality or more worldly aspect of the self. And this occult self, this detachable spark that he'll call pneuma, he traces back, and this is a kind of standard scholarly consensus at this point, traces it back to the shamans of the Scythian shamans, who had that would fill up tents full of cannabis, and had a more what we would recognize as a traditional kind of shamanic culture, with the shamanic idea that the shaman is able to detach their soul from their body and move through these other worlds and return. And what Bloom says is that what Plato does is kind of meld this, or misread, in this anxiety of influence way, misread this idea and by assimilating it into his more rationalist idea of reason as a higher faculty that's able to perceive the world of forms. Once he lays this out, then Bloom goes on and talks about poetry as a model of Gnosticism, and particularly Gnostic experience. And by poetry, he doesn't mean just that you can point to poems that use symbols and allegories that have a Gnostic character. That's not really very interesting to Bloom, and in some sense is not ultimately very interesting to us. It's just simply more, oh yeah, look, they're using, Gnostic images. Okay, there's a pearl, there's a serpent. All right, great. What Bloom is trying to point to more is that that poetry allows a kind of knowing or a kind of experience in the reader, not in the poet himself, but in the reader, that has analogies with aspects of Gnostic experience. And one of the most important things for Bloom in talking about Gnostic experience is the idea that there is something original in us that is before creation, that is before nature. So he hones in on that particular aspect of Gnosticism, the idea that there are sparks of the pleroma distributed through this lower creation of matter, and that these sparks, in some sense, are more original than all of the matter and the nature that they're embedded in. They're earlier, they're aboriginal, and that what this then gets manifested in the self, in our own personal psychology, mirrored in poetry, mirrored in philosophy, mirrored in what Bloom calls the American religion, which I'll get to a little bit more in a moment. But what's important for Bloom is this sense that there is something in us that is before nature. There is something in us that is before the world of matter and extension and diversity. In Zen terms, you could say this is this is what your face looked like before you were born, which is one of those Zen koans. So what is your face before you were born? It's some pure, unmediated, what's it that is able to perceive or continues to perceive, is part of perception, even as it is constantly drawn into identification with matter, or identification with nature, or identification with the body, or with the ordinary personality, with what he calls the psyche. So there's this tension between the pneuma and the psyche, but it has to do in part with originality and with beforeness. Now, Bloom, in a fairly perverse way, or a strongly misreading way, identifies this spirit with what he calls the American religion. And what he wants to argue is that there is a kind of particular American sensibility that you find both in writers like Whitman and Emerson, and later writers like Wallace Stevens, that stress this kind of original self, this experience of the freedom of an original self. And then he links that with more conventional or mainstream experiences of religion in America, particularly forms of Protestantism, but also Mormonism and other things. Now, Bloom's book on the American religion, called The American Religion, is a great book. It's totally worth reading. It's really fun. He reads religious thinkers as if they were poets, without reducing them merely to literary language, because his own approach to literature is so spiritual. So it really gets to a very beautiful place, and it's full of fascinating ideas, but it's certainly unconventional. And indeed, when Richard Smoley addresses Bloom in Smoley's book on Gnosticism, Forbidden Faith, he pretty much takes him to task for kind of making it up and saying, look, really, what does this have to do with the ancient Gnostics at this point? Aren't you just like broadening this term so far that it doesn't mean anything anymore? And we've already encountered that issue, that Gnosticism becomes a term of art in the critic, in the writer, in the philosopher, and it's sort of so loosely defined and so kind of mysterious and interesting and rebellious that it's attractive to use it in a wide variety of ways, so much so that the use of the term itself arguably begins to wane. But I still think it's an extremely useful tack, and we see in the Bloom text a really beautiful approach to it. Another interesting thing to note is how he wants to shift while maintaining the validity of Gnostic experience and the Gnostic view of the world, shifted away from the religious sphere. And he does that by saying that the ultimate content of the Gnostic flash, of the experience of Gnosis, is not a Gnosticism, is not a religion or even a worldview or even information about the structure of the cosmos. It's ultimately knowledge of the self. And that this psychological dimension is what allows a continuity between a religious and a secular experience of Gnosis. And so he wants to say that the experience of Gnosis is still valid, and indeed is perhaps more valid in these rarefied worlds of literature, and particularly a certain strand of lyrical poetry that comes out of Romanticism. And finally, the aspect that I perhaps appreciate the most upon rereading this, which I had forgotten, is how he emphasizes that Gnosticism as a form of knowledge is not a content, is not static, and it is not about being. Usually when we think in terms of what's the essence of something, we think about it as having a being. And Platonism would itself support this, that if you get right down there, the ultimate being of something is its essence. And what Bloom is picking up in a somewhat existentialist way, although he's by no means an existentialist, is that what the content of Gnostic knowledge is not a being, but a happening, an event, a practice, something that moves. And he says, Gnosis, whether in Gnosticism or in Emerson, emphasizes that transition is more real than being. The psyche, that means the lower personality, belongs to experience, to time and history, to ordinary experience, what he means, to time and history, to what is moment to moment. But the knowing of Gnosis is momentary and beyond experience. It's performative knowledge. Now, exactly what that means is hard to say. Obviously, what's the difference between experience and momentary experience? But he wants to emphasize that there is a rupture in Gnosis, a rupture that is simultaneously an escape from the conventional order of beings, which is organized by society, which is organized by tradition, which is organized by history, by the body, by organs. If you remember Artaud going off about the body without organs. Instead, Bloom wants to point to a kind of a rupture or a transition, a liminal zone, maybe even a kind of maybe logic that breaks the order of being in a way that escapes a certain kind of modern experience, even as it reproduces it. Because if modernity is about anything, it's about rupture. It's about breaking. It's about the struggle with the Father. It's about overturning tradition. So in a weird way, Bloom is both being utterly modern and extremely traditional at the same time. And it's partly that balance in his work that I find so fascinating. You'll see in the poem that's attached to the PDF, that A.R. Amon's poem for Harold Bloom, I think a very beautiful poetic expression of this literary gnosis, and one that will resonate with a number of the images that we've already spoken about in this class, particularly the idea, the association of the pneuma or the spirit with the mountain, as opposed to the valley of the soul or psyche. But I'll leave you to read that poem, and just perhaps we can talk about it online, and I might come back to a Stevens poem at the end of this lecture too. But if you're at all intrigued by the Stevens quotes in the Bloom essay, I highly encourage you to read Stevens. He's definitely one of my favorite poets, and while he did love the body and love the world, and he was not a religious man in any sense, there is a profound Gnostic spirituality and even a kind of Buddhism in a lot of his writing that's made even more powerful by the fact that he's not trying to be spiritual. Now, the next text we read is in some ways a less interesting thing. It's by June Singer, who's a Jungian analyst, and is very much working inside of Jung's frame of mind. And I chose it for a number of reasons. One is that it was very important to have some Jungian takes on Gnosis included in the class because, again, as Richard Smoley notes, that Jung is probably the single most important force in bringing Gnosticism and Gnosis back into modern knowledge beyond the esoteric world of theosophists and other sort of 19th century dabblers and mystagogues who became interested with the Gnostic texts that we had. Jung really took Gnosticism very seriously. He took it as a model of the psyche and not as a model of the cosmos, to the degree that he could maintain that particular paradox, but to the degree that he still approached things quote unquote scientifically, or at least in terms of a secular framework of psychology, he brought Gnosticism out of a religious framework and into a modern psychological framework within which the idea of wholeness or of integration is a kind of goal, and that the Gnostic return to the pleroma, to the fullness, and their escape from the disaster of matter and the Archons is actually a psycho-spiritual process of integrating the shadow side and the dark side of the psyche into a greater fullness. I'm not entirely convinced of this model, although I think it's very interesting to wrestle with, and I do believe that it explains part of the attraction to Gnosticism. I do think there's some violence done to the real alienation that's implied in Gnosticism, and particularly its hostility to the world and to many degrees matter. Nonetheless, it's an extremely rich and engaging way of looking at how people are attempting to misread, in Harold Bloom's terms, misread a tradition of Gnosticism into something that is useful and profound and resonant for modern human beings. So what Singer does, and it's a very elegant job of digging in and looking at one particular Gnostic text, something that comes from the Nag Hammadi books called, what is this called? Exegesis on the Soul, and chooses this text as a one that illustrates this process of individuation, of turning away from projection into the world towards a look at the self as a way of moving through and processing the shadow side and opening up to a higher principle that's a principle of integration that in turn kind of propels the self into a greater embrace of cosmic wholeness. So all that's very interesting. But the other reason that I chose this text is that it's a woman writing about a very feminine-oriented Gnostic text. And we have already mentioned the way that gender is a very rich and dynamic dimension of Gnostic experience and Gnostic writings. Not necessarily the feminist liberation that some people might want to believe with the sort of current wave of, Magdalene, Gnostic, feminist, Da Vinci Code, blah, blah, blah. Nonetheless, the vision of gender and of feminine spirituality and feminine power is vastly richer and more dynamic in the Gnostic tradition than it is in the conventional Orthodox one. And so it's not accidental that Singer chose a text that is particularly highlighted in this way and sees the soul as essentially a feminine force, whose involvement in the world of the Archons or the world of matter is seen in terms of prostitution and rape, and whose recovery of the higher good is seen in terms of a preparation for a wedding and an ultimate encounter with the bridegroom, with an explicit sexual dimension, although the text also emphasized that this is not a carnal encounter. Nonetheless, the images of union and of the bridal chamber, etc., are certainly using, like alchemy, the images of sexuality as a way to stage some deeper questions or experiences of wholeness and integration. The I guess one of the other issues that this brings up for me is just the kind of over-reliance on the image of wholeness as a good, as well as the, to my mind, fairly romantic idea that when we're floating in our mother's bellies, we're just in a blissful state of union, and only upon entering the world and getting our butt slapped do we break away from this kind of, glorious fusion. And while there is clearly a drive towards fusion inside the human psyche, and that it's partly mediated through our relationship with our parents and with our mother and with lovers who then stand in for this sort of lost world, it's not clear to me that the lost world actually really exists, or certainly existed in the womb. That even babies get knocked around and have a rough time inside the belly. So there's a little bit of a patina of a kind of holist romanticism that I don't find as resonant in Singer as I do in other texts. Nonetheless, I think it's a very valuable and nourishing way of looking at Gnostic imagery. The final text is a very short one by a fellow named Erik Wilson, about whom I know nothing, except that somebody pointed me to this really, really nifty essay that's clearly part of a larger work. And basically, Wilson is what we would call in modern terms a depressive, though we would call in more traditional terms a melancholic. And he's someone who's interested in valorizing or affirming depression as a rich state of being, or melancholia as a rich state of being with a lot of good to it. And this is, of course, going very much against the modern grain. And he wants to see it as a sort of veil of soul making. And he's not the first to do this. The kind of post-Jungian psychologist James Hillman writes very, very eloquently and quite beautifully on melancholia and depression, in terms of it being a site of meaning rather than something that needs to be avoided, or certainly something that needs to be medicated. And there's an interesting echo between Bloom and Wilson here when he talks about this issue of medication, because of course that's the great conflict right there. If one is going to approach one's depression as a possible site of meaning, one is confronting directly the dominant story and the dominant shamans in our society, which are the doctors holding pills, letting you know that depression is simply an organic malady that you're not responsible for, has nothing to do with you as a person, and can be treated through a combination of pills and therapy, blah, 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 blah. You know the story. So to instead say, well, actually, in some ways I am my melancholy, or I want to affirm my melancholy and actually explore it, is really kind of a nutso move. And at one point Wilson says, I am not reducible to neurons and my surroundings. So he's explicitly saying that there is a part of the self, a part of his self, that is not reducible to the materialist account of subjectivity. He says that something in my being transcends these limiting factors. Certainly I cannot escape entirely my faulty neurotransmitters or my vexed history. However, I can choose how I interpret these boundaries. I can see them as important but not final factors in my melancholia, and I can see this choice as an enactment of my freedom. I think this is a beautiful, not only psychological insight, but a beautiful reflection of a genuine Gnostic wrestling that, to my mind, is more believable and useful than the one we saw with Singer, because, of course, Wilson does go on later to valorize the Gnostics as people who really recognize the same power of dark perception that he talks about. But in this idea that he's laying out, we see an echo of Bloom, that there isn't something in the self that is not reducible to the order of facts that constitutes nature, even the order of facts that proves that obviously our psychological states are directly influenced by the state of our brain, by balances of neurotransmitters, et cetera, et cetera. And no one can deny that. Wilson is not attempting to deny it. But what he is saying is that there's something in the self that eludes this network, and that in choosing that perception, or in choosing to inhabit that fragment or that spark, that very choice is an enactment of freedom, even as that freedom or that enactment of freedom takes place within a network of fate, within a network of necessity, the necessity of having a brain, the necessity of having a crappy history or a crappy relationship with your parents, or most importantly here, the necessity of confronting the neurological facts that constitute you. So this dance of freedom and fate is, to me, one of the most important dynamics that we draw out of Gnosticism, that there's on the one hand, a very intense and sobering view of the nature of control, the nature of necessity embedded in our bodies, in societies, in nature, in the processes of organic decay. And yet there is a line of freedom, but it's a very elusive one, and it's difficult to pinpoint. At the end of Harold Bloom's essay, he talks about that freedom in Wallace Stevens is always a matter of evasion. It's not taking a position or arguing some philosophical point that clears a space for the being of freedom. Instead, freedom is found through a kind of evasion, and that the spiritual aspect of Stevens' poetics is often through this kind of elusive, slippery, almost like a wink out of the corner of your eye. And the sense there is that maybe that's it. Maybe that is the place of transition. That is the place of the slippage that allows us or opens up a space of genuine freedom, not something that we can ever really pin down or ever really carve out of this sort of maelstrom of forces and networks that are constantly trying to vex us. As an example of this evasion, and I'm not saying you're going to pick it up the first time you hear it, but I would just like to read one of my favorite Stevens poems and one of his most famous poems, and it's said to have been the last poem he wrote, so it's like a death poem in Japanese tradition, and it's called Of Mere Being. The palm at the end of the mind, beyond the last thought, rises in the bronze decor. A gold-feathered bird sings in the palm, without human meaning, without human feeling, a foreign song. You know then that it is not the reason that makes us happy or unhappy. The bird sings, its feathers shine. The palm stands at the edge of space. The wind moves slowly through the branches. The bird's fire-fangled feathers dangle down. This last 2 weeks we're going to look at some manifestations of contemporary Gnosis as opposed to Gnosticism. And what I mean by that is representations of Gnostic experience, of something like a direct perception into the nature of reality, either in fiction or in psychological, neurological fact, or in psychedelic experience. And this week we'll be looking at 2 pieces by Philip K. Dick, who's, I'm sure, a great favorite of many of yours, certainly of mine, and one of the writers who really got me interested in Gnosticism, and particularly the modern or postmodern manifestations of Gnosticism. My senior thesis at Yale was called The Postmodern Gnosis of Philip K. Dick. And since that time, I've really been interested in a lot of these issues kind of through the lens of Dick's work. And one of the many, many things that makes Dick's work so fascinating is, particularly from this Gnostic point of view, is the way that his obsession with fictional or false worlds that are deconstructed or transformed in the course of his fictions, stretches back to the late 1950s. And while he was already interested in issues of religion and spirituality, that in many ways his fictional questioning of this idea preceded his later philosophical and spiritual concern with the nature of reality, and particularly with the Gnostic account of the nature of reality. But even weirder than that, of course, is that after years and years and years of writing very peculiar fictional stories of inbreakings of God or transformations of reality, breakdowns in reality constructs, and et cetera, that Dick himself underwent a very extreme version of such a deconstruction of reality in 1974 with his famous pink light experience, which he talks about in the nonfiction piece that we read this week. How to, what is it called? How to Build a Universe That Doesn't Fall Apart 2 Days Later. But the first thing we're going to look at is a story, my favorite Philip K. Dick story, from which he wrote in 1968, when things were kind of starting to go downhill in Mr. Dick's life. The next few years were pretty dark, and they would also see the writing one of my favorite of his novels, A Maze of Death, which is unremittingly dark, and yet, particularly from a religious or allegorical dimension, is one of his most fascinating works, and not often mentioned as one of his great ones, although I was happy to hear that they will be including it in the next volume of the collected Philip K. Dick that's coming out from the Library of America. In any case, The Electric Ant gives us a slightly different twist on Philip K. Dick's version of the Gnostic scenario. The basic scenario is that reality as his characters know it is not what it appears to be, and something that they do or discover, or perhaps through no action of their own, this reality begins to disintegrate, and they're forced to deal with the consequences to get back to the original reality, to figure out what's going on, etc., etc. And you can see, of course, the connections here with a Gnostic belief that our world is a fallen world, an invention of a demiurge rather than the highest God, and that even Eden, this sort of beautiful, lovely garden, can be seen in some ways as a trap or a simulacrum. And so this is one of the ways in which Dick, more than a lot of authors who were discussed as being Gnostics, really does lay claim to that label. But in Electric Ant, it's a somewhat different and more psychological version of a Gnostic scenario, because the reality that is deconstructed, sort of, or at least for most of the framework of the story, is not the reality of the character themselves, but rather the personal reality of that one single character. So it's not like the whole world that he's in is being called into question, more his own nature, and through that nature opens up to a larger and deeper questioning of reality itself. Because this is a Philip K. Dick story, so there's always going to be slippage between levels and dimensions. You'll never know exactly where to stand. So the basic framework is we have this character, Garson Poole, who wakes up from an accident and realizes that he is not actually a human being, but in fact is an electric ant, or an android, essentially. Although the fact that Dick invokes an insect here, I think, is kind of important, especially when you look at his concern for animals in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which has some interesting parallels with this story. So he discovers that, in fact, he's not who he thinks he is. But there is a little flavor of the more cosmic picture that a traditional Gnostic would hold, in terms of the rulership of the world being controlled by Archons living at various levels of reality. Because one of the things that lends pathos to the situation of Garson Poole is that, like many of Dick's more benign characters, he's sort of a businessman, and he runs his business TriStar. But it turns out, of course, that he doesn't actually run the business of TriStar, that TriStar is owned by aliens from the Prox system, shades of Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and Garson himself is really a figurehead, an electric ant who's sort of set there to give people someone to look at, but is in fact not actually in charge of the show. So here we have a little sense of the political or archonic dimension of the Gnostic reality perspective, reflecting itself in a story that in other ways is much more about individual, internal, psychological experience, and particularly an experience that we can think of as both a kind of gnosis and also a kind of self-deconstruction, and even in Domal's terms, a kind of suicide. And I think that what Garson Poole ends up doing is really interesting to think about in terms of Domal's idea that it is only through perpetual suicide that we create a space of a kind of freedom. Because what Garson Poole does, as you know reading the story, is that upon discovering that he is an android, an electric ant, he also discovers that his reality is produced by a tape that's running through a mechanism. And of course, this is such a corny image, it's really funny, in our digital age, to think of an analog tape being the source of a whole complex creature's reality. But it's a very interesting and funny decision on Dick's part. There are a lot of goofy machines and goofy technologies throughout Dick's work, things that never looked like they were possible, that always have a kind of absurdist, symbolic, or even allegorical character. You think about the black box in the Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, or the Mercer device that allows people to connect with people, and any number of Dr. Smile, the suitcase, et cetera, any number of other odd objects that kind of are teachings in the guise of a funny machine. And here this tape is one as well, because of course the metaphor of reality as a kind of tape or a kind of program was very important in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s. And it comes up over and over again. I mean, you can think about the career of John Lilly, who starts out in the 1950s doing experiments with the brain as a behaviorist, kind of a really radical approach to the idea that the brain is a kind of device that records and projects realities, and that you can manipulate this device in order to change people's perspective, and in some sense to kind of brainwash them. And of course Lilly abandons this work and goes on to have a much more sort of interesting, interactive relationship with reality construction through his own experiments with psychedelics and isolation tanks and linguistic frameworks, et cetera, et cetera. And in the 1970s he started doing a lot of courses that involve tapes, and he would play tapes over and over again and play tape loops over and over again. And it wasn't just as a way to play with sound, but actually to say something about tape, and tape as a metaphor for, or magnetic audio tape, audiovisual tape, as a metaphor for how we code and construct reality. The same metaphor comes up in Burroughs. It comes up in Dianetics, in Scientology. And so it becomes a sort of a major metaphor that Dick is really having a lot of fun with here, because he goes into the technical detail, the punched holes on the reader and the charge, all these sort of funny technical details that are rendered absurd by the fact that the whole technology is so kind of ridiculous. Nonetheless, it gives us a really important idea here, which is that upon discovery that your reality is in many ways, most ways perhaps, a construct, suddenly there's a sort of relationship you have to your own constructing creativity, which in this case is externalized as a kind of machine. So there's Garson Poole, who is the product of the machine, and then there's the Garson Poole who's capable of tinkering with his own reality construction device. And Dick really highlights the way that this is a kind of technical manipulation, a kind of tinkering. And I think this is a really instrumental, because it shows that in some ways the work of, if not liberation, then at least of understanding the self, and in some ways of integrating the self, involves a paradoxical kind of technologizing or objectivizing of aspects of the self. So even if you want to become a fuller and richer human being, to know who you really are, you have to start treating parts of yourself that might seem to be just who you are, normal human reactions and experiences, and instead start seeing them under the sign of these technical control mechanisms of tapes, of programming, of little punched holes in that running over a certain kind of reader. And so what Poole starts to do is to tinker with this machine, to play with the tape and fill tape over the holes and see what the effects are on his reality. It's almost like somebody taking drugs or doing meditation or doing sensory deprivation, doing experiments with our technical psychophysiology, and then just simply seeing the results. This is a tried and true path of the, first-hand spiritual explorer who's unwilling to take accounts of reality based that they find in books, instead must find it through their own kind of experimentalism. This is a very important part of the whole countercultural scene, and particularly its spirituality, with its emphasis on practices and experiences and psychoactives and meditation and all these various tools and techniques for modifying consciousness. So Garson Poole starts modifying his consciousness in a major way, and suggests that it's possible not only to shape his experience, but to experience everything. That if he removes the tape, that he will see it all, as if like the veil of reality is pulled back and the full blazing light of God or the absolute will shine over everything. Earlier in the story, before the weird ending, he even talks about there's a little setup for this moment that will happen. What would it have looked like, he said, if this TV set, he's just talking about TV set now, not his own gear, if this TV set projected all channels onto the cathode ray screen at the same time? Could we have distinguished anything in that mixture? I don't think so. Well, maybe we could learn to be selective, do our own job of perceiving what we wanted to and what we didn't. Think of the possibilities if our brain could handle 20 images at once. Think of the knowledge which could be stored during a given period. So you have this idea, which is also represented in The Man Who Fell to Earth, that David Bowie movie that was important to Philip K. Dick and influenced his portrayal of the film Valis and the book Valis. There's also an image of a huge number of screens and this idea of being able to watch many screens at once. And at the culmination of The Electric Ant, we have this sort of moment of gnosis, this moment of experiencing everything through nothing, by removing the tape, that all comes through. And this is a image of gnosis, not as like even understanding the self, but is in a particular form of seeing and knowing everything at once, in a way you can't possibly imagine being able to organize or control, and yet it is a knowing. It's not simply a I am one with everything, or seeing that everything is one, or it's not a unity consciousness, it's a totality consciousness. And there's something about that totality consciousness that's always struck me as being particularly fascinating and rich, because it's kind of like the one and the everything at once. And if there's anything that could be seen as a kind of gnosis, if you remember that there's that idea of knowledge in gnosis, wouldn't it be to know everything? Not just to know it as one, but to know it, to know it in its full extent. And that's sort of what's gestured to at the end of the story, as well as the larger philosophical problem of whether our individual minds construct the totality of reality or not, and I will leave that conundrum to you. The second text that we're reading is a nonfiction piece by Dick, probably my favorite, or at least the one I think is the most interesting, although its parts of it are much less interesting than others. how to build a universe that doesn't fall apart 2 days later. And I believe though it's a speech, I think that it first made its appearance as the introduction to I Hope I Shall Arrive Soon, which was his last collection of short stories published in his life, and a number of which are actually very particularly interesting from a religious or Gnostic perspective, or at least a perspective that's interested in the bardo and these afterlife states and how to navigate through them. What Dick is taking on here, and right off the bat, is this fundamentally sort of politicized Gnostic idea that the false realities that he writes about and the false realities that are described in Gnosticism and Kabbalah and other systems, that these false realities are, in a sense, brought to life by the media technology of our day, that the connection between mainstream media and politics and economics and social control create this essentially Gnostic situation of Archons battling over various reality constructs with our own minds and hearts as kind of the spaces that are vampirized by these larger constructs in their competition to organize and frame the nature of reality, whether these are advertising or political ideologies, corporate think styles, spiritual cults, etc., etc. There's this sort of feeding frenzy of reality that Dick sees, and he sees the way that as technology and media improve, that more and more well-realized worlds will be able to be delivered into our minds. Of course, things worked out a little bit differently, like a lot of the Big Brother constructs that we see in the past. It turns out to be a very different kind of situation. Not that we don't have Big Brother problems today, but of course the internet and the multiplication of media channels has made it very difficult for single dominant perspectives to simply dominate with reality constructs. It's not that there aren't massive forms of domination, but they take a somewhat different character than a lot of people from the 70s, for example, would think about how social control is going to be used through the media. But after Dick makes this kind of connection between about the politics of reality creation, he goes on a very interesting rant that I think I'm going to read at some length and then talk about, because I think it's particularly fascinating about his own writing, and as I said, I know a lot of you are interested in his writing in particular, but also about some of the ways it shows this relationship that we've been playing with throughout this course between reading and text, and this kind of experience of Gnosis, or at least the experience of Gnosis that comes about through recognizing that reality is a construct and that there are deeper dimensions of reality that we could perhaps perceive. Because these two things in some ways seem kind of opposite. You know, we tend to think of like everything we read in books is mediated knowledge. It's kind of canned knowledge or canned experience. It's at least one step removed from the real deal, whereas quote unquote direct experience doesn't really have to do with books. And, you know, that's a justifiable understanding on one level, but I think that throughout this course we've been showing, or at least I've been interested in trying to talk about the way that the very act that we're doing, reading text, interpreting text, is itself a space to mobilize and even engage with something like this deeper, more direct experience of Gnosis, and that the two are not as contradictory as they might seem. There's more like a dance. So he's talking about how we're bombarded with pseudo-realities manufactured by very sophisticated people using very powerful electronic mechanisms. And he starts to talk about this power, that of creating whole universes of the mind. Again, this is a kind of demiurgic power. I ought to know, he says. I do the same thing. It is my job to create universes as the basis of one novel after another.
and I have to build them in such a way that they do not fall apart 2 days later. Or at least, that is what my editors hope. However, I will reveal a secret to you. I like to build universes which do fall apart. I like to see them come unglued, and I like to see how the characters in the novels cope with this problem. I have a secret love of chaos. There should be more of it. Do not believe, do not assume that order and stability are always good in a society or in a universe. The old, the ossified, must always give way to new life and the birth of new things. Before the new things can be born, the old must perish. This is a dangerous realization because it tells us that we must eventually part with much of what is familiar to us, and that hurts. But that is part of the script of life. Unless we can psychologically accommodate change, we ourselves will begin to die inwardly. What I am saying is that objects, customs, habits, and ways of life must perish so that the authentic human being can live. And it is the authentic human being who matters most, the viable, elastic organism which can bounce back, absorb, and deal with the new. So there's a number of great things here. One is that Dick is making a connection between the fictional construction of the world and the ideological construction of reality. And on another level, that's maybe less explicit in this passageway, but it becomes more obvious later in the text where he talks about his own religious experience, on a spiritual level, the idea that the world itself is a kind of construct. He invokes the Hindu concept of Maya, that there's a sort of veil of illusion that's masking a true landscape, a true reality, which he suggests in the somewhat kookier parts of this essay later on may indeed be the landscape of Rome or the Near East as well in 50 A.D., shortly after the passing of Jesus. So we're not going to go into that concept particularly. But what is interesting is that you have these layers of different kinds of reality constructs, and then he admits this secret love of chaos, of wanting to build worlds which do fall apart, partly because he distrusts the reality creation power in itself, but also because he wants to see what happens to his characters. He wants to see what happens to the people. He wants to see what happens to us. So in some ways, it's like the discovery that reality is in some sense a construction, neurological, social, cultural, linguistic, personal, psychological, etc., etc., etc. It's not just about, venturing deeper into the world of what is really real. It's also, and perhaps more importantly, a process of seeing what happens to the self, or how the self transforms as it confronts the breakdown of these illusions, or the breakdown of the naive confidence in the way things may appear. And so Dix admits his secret love of chaos not because he just wants to destroy in a kind of revolt, which we've seen already in some of the texts we read, the sort of feeling like that reality is controlled by these various forces, and so only an extreme revolt is ethically justified. It's only in that we can hope to have some truth. Dick, I think, is a little bit different than that. He's not quite so driven by that kind of anti-authoritarian impulse. He has an anti-authoritarian side, but he also has a side that respects the small businessman, that respects ordinary law, and that frankly respects Christianity. And in many ways, he was a Christian from the 1964 on, or at least he would often self-describe himself as an Episcopalian. And that's important to keep in mind. And it's particularly important to keep in mind when we turn to the second part of the passage I read, which is his discussion of how the destruction of the world, whether it's seen as habit or custom or psychological perception or cultural habit, that the destruction of the world is actually the route to the genuinely human, to the authentically human. And it's an interesting phrase. It's not quite a Gnostic phrase. There's always that quality of otherworldliness to the Gnostic essence. It's the spark or the alien man, or it's the sense that it's something that has nothing to do with the world that we habitually recognize as a human world. But Dick has a very strong feeling, a very powerful valorization of ordinary humanity, not mystically transformed humanity, not not a Platonic Superman or a shaman, etc., but for just ordinary folks struggling, confused, suffering, deluded, lustful, angry, hurt. This is the characteristics of your basic Dick heroes. But he sees them in not just a value for their own struggling selves, which in some ways is a kind of Christian value of valorization of the ordinary sinful self, rather than a belief that you can transform this into some kind of magical spiritual Superman. But it also has to do, I think, more profoundly with his sense of the new. He talks about of novelty, of growth, of the elasticity, the bounce back, the constant dynamics of psychological and cultural and personal growth and transformation. This is really what he's valorizing as the authentically human, that it's this almost Taoist process of transformation, of following the logic of change, and that not to change is to die. Not to change, in some sense, is to be under the power of the Archons. That the way the Archons manifest and maintain us, or one of the ways they do it, one of the strongest ways they do it, is through habit. Habits of perception, habits of behavior, habits of language, habits of organization. You can look at institutions as extremely established habits of how they manage money and personnel and data flows, and that change with great difficulty, as anybody who works in institutions knows. So the power of habit in many ways is a sort of less mythological way to look at the power of the Archons. Even keeping the stars moving in the sky is a kind of habit. And so what Dick is suggesting is that there's a sort of counter logic, a kind of liberatory logic of chaos, of noise on the line, of distortion. I think here Burroughs's explorations and experiments with language would very much fit in line with some of this sensibility, although Burroughs is much more misanthropic than Dick is. But this idea of like breaking the code or scrambling the code of reality as a way to sort of open up this space of deeper novelty and deeper authenticity is extremely important to Dick, and it gives casts a rich light on a lot of the dynamics of his stories. There's a lot of other stuff that goes on in this fascinating text, and a lot of it does have to do with textuality, with reading. And if you remember when we talked about, some ways you can look at the Gnostics as the guys who read Genesis against the grain, that rather than buying the normal story about what the story of Genesis in the garden meant, they were like, no, this is a disinformation, this is a conspiracy, we're going to read it ironically, or we're going to read it, we're going to parody it, we're going to make fun of it, we're going to mock it, we're going to read it against the grain. And in that reading against the grain, there's the gesture of liberation, in the escape from the fictional world of the orthodox view of the garden, by inverting the meaning of the serpent, by inverting the meaning of Eve's attraction to the serpent, that there's a space of liberation that's opened. And that sense of reading as opening up these multiple possibilities that themselves suggest a deeper kind of freedom, Bloom echoed that in another way, is something that you can trace sort of in and out as Dick tries to interpret his own writings as affirming this religious view that he's developing late in his life. It's not convincing, and in fact, in some ways it reads a little bit diluted, maybe even more than a little bit. But it does show this essential logic of reading against the grain.
Pharmakognosis. And the name Pharmakognosis comes from a series of books by a California poet named Dale Pendle. Great books. And they frame in a way the main topic for this week, which is the relationship between a sort of Gnostic emphasis on immediate spiritual experience and to some degree a Gnostic worldview of Archons and a lower or false world which is penetrated by messages and beings from a higher world, and how these two aspects of Gnosis are reflected or amplified or triggered, catalyzed by drug experience, particularly psychedelic experience. Because if there, is a reason, one of the main reasons I believe that Gnosis is still a compelling metaphor for us is that it intensifies this view that at the core of the quest for religion or spirituality or insight is something like a direct, unmediated, and extraordinary individual experience. Something like pure experience is the route in to these deeper issues. This is very much in contrast with an Orthodox Christian perspective or conventional Christian perspective, where authority lies in the revelations of the past, which are now closed and are captured in Scripture and captured in an institution and in certain strategies of interpretation. So, as a born-again Christian, most of the time, I can rely on these structures of authority to inform my religious experience and to guide my life. Of course, there are these moments of direct experience even inside something that we think of as being not very Gnostic, like Christianity, and particularly evangelical Christianity, where there's a great deal of emphasis on personal experience, both the conversion experience when you see the light and you become born again and you become a new man and you turn away from your previous life. In some ways these models and metaphors are very resonant with some of the things we've been talking about in Gnosticism, and even the kinds of ecstatic experiences that characterize certain kind of Pentecostal cults and sects. So just to say that the issue of direct experience we're going to find throughout religions in Islam and Buddhism, etc., etc. So it's not specifically linked to Gnosis per se, and yet I think that because of its heretical quality and its underground quality and the relationship that Gnosticism has to magical and hermetic traditions in the West, that all of those things lead to a particular Gnostic flavor when coming to the question of psychedelic experience and the relationship of psychedelic experience to spirituality. Because it's certainly true for I think people from the hippie generation on, from the boomers on, that if you talk to people who are in some sort of spiritual search or who have a deeply spiritual perspective on things that is not informed simply by the religion they were raised up in, that most of the time you're going to find that psychedelics played a role somewhere along the way, or at least a lot of the time, and oftentimes at the beginning. Oftentimes it's our ordinary, materialist, real-world, American consumer mind frame that gets shattered, sometimes as kids, sometimes as college students, gets shattered with an unexpectedly intense and revelatory experience of compounds, and then trying to make sense of our lives in the wake of these things. Some people, not all, but some people find that they can no longer live in exactly the same worldview that they had before, and this experience then opens up a quest or a kind of seeking, and some people find and some people never find, and it's hard to know exactly which of those is the preferable state in any case. But there is something about this experience of, or the sense of having an experience that itself kind of changes your fundamental view of the world, such that things that previously seemed completely normal now seem a little unreal. And at the same time, there's this sense of some deeper reality which remains elusive, but is touched and tasted in glimpses. And so there's this kind of basic Gnostic format or structure that some people discover through psychoactives. So then this brings this question of how do we deal with these experiences? What does one do with them? In a sense, they're even less grounded to any sense of tradition than some of these Gnostic experiences that we've looked at, particularly in the more archaic texts. And yet, in some ways, there is a similar kind of revelation, again, that the world as you took it was not quite what it seemed, that there is another world, that there are layers, multiple layers of reality, of cosmic reality, and that there are sources that are both deeply inside the self and deeply inside the cosmos that can communicate to one another, and that we sort of witness and are transformed through these communications, and that there is something in the self, to think about it in Bloom terms, that there's something in the self that sort of pre-exists or has a different order of reality than the ordinary personality, which often becomes shattered in stronger psychoactive experiences. So for this final week of the Gnosis class, I selected three different texts that turn on this question of psychedelic experience and Gnostic experience, or really psychoactive, because one of them is not a psychedelic, but a far nastier substance called carbon tetrachloride, which is basically like a solvent, nonetheless producing a similar kind of effect. Probably the Pendle text is the place to start. Pendle has achieved an extraordinary, monumental achievement in his 3 books in the Pharmakognosis series. Not only has he taken on the task of writing about pretty much every psychoactive you can think of, and as well as a few that you can't think of because you've never heard of before, but he has done it in an extraordinary fashion. And in a way, he's tried to answer one of the main problems that all of these texts raise, which is, how do you write about this stuff? Why even bother trying when such a powerful signature of these experiences is their ineffable or untranslatable quality, the way in which the information or insights they give seem to some degree even dependent on the state itself. Charles Tart talks about state-specific knowledge, the idea that once you're actually in a state, like being in a dream, or having satori, or being very high on LSD, that there are forms of knowledge that make perfect sense and that you can even pick up if you've been there before from previous experiences, but then in the interim, they just disappear. They're not part of the room. They need to be in the state in order to be present. So the whole question of how you write about it, the relationship that we've been looking at through the whole class between gnosis and texts, reading and experiencing, becomes even more intensified in some ways, or at least more obviously intensified with the question of drugs, because we can all agree that there are extraordinary or intense or bizarre experiences in drug states, but the question of how you then write about them or reflect them into writing in that form of communication is a very strong one. What Pendle decided to do is to reflect the multidimensional quality of the space itself. And I'll say what I mean by that. That I think more than most things, and this is one of the reasons for their abiding interest, that psychoactives demand to be approached from multiple frameworks, from multiple reality tunnels. Just to give a brief link, I don't really believe you can come to terms or even begin to grapple with the issues raised by powerful psychoactives unless you look at pharmacology, biology, history, psychology, religion, anthropology, visual art. I know I'm forgetting a handful of other ones. The point being that the nature of the experience, and particularly the relationship of mind and molecule, the relationship of substance and consciousness, opens up multiple dimensions of human experience. More so, I believe, than most factors of human experience that we analyze, that they are fundamentally multidisciplinary objects of study and experience. So what Pendle has done brilliantly is to reflect this multidimensionality in his writing. He is generally a poet. Most of the other work that he's done has been poetry, and there are a number of poetic voices in this text. He has sections called The Ally, where he uses poetry as a way to kind of express the peculiar quality that is associated with specific plant substances, using the kind of shamanic metaphor of the ally. But at the same time, he'll include all of these other manner of texts and writing. He will talk about pharmacology in depth because he knows his stuff. He knows his chemistry. He knows his amines. He will talk about history. He will quote books of philosophy or of alchemy or of underground street lore. He'll go into personal stories. He'll make jokes. And these different kinds of texts will sort of knock up against one another. So what you wind up with is this grand collage. And there's, of course, as you'll see in the PDF, lots of images as well that he's drawing from all sorts of texts. Again, some chemical, some historical, some mythological. And these images, too, begin to resonate. And so what he's doing is that in addition to like providing information or giving insight or providing sort of atmospheric evocations of particular substances, which is itself a tall order, he's also showing in the multiplicity or the heterogeneity of the text, all the different kinds of texts that are in it. He's telling you something about the space, and this is very much about the proper way to approach it. And what you'll see in the selection I have is part of the chapter on LSD, where you'll see a more kind of personal voice and a reflection of the Gnostic-like experience of a solid LSD session as new kinds of knowledge become available and the old world falls away and there's a kind of death of the body, a kind of even a revulsion of the decay of the body, which produces a kind of light that then in turn is sort of integrated back into experience. And then at the end there's a couple of texts, short texts from the beginning of the volume, that really speak more generally to the issue of the pharmakon, or the poison path. Pharmakon is an extraordinary word in Greek. It's where we get pharmacology from, or pharmacy. But the idea of the pharmakon that's so extraordinary is that it is simultaneously a poison and a medicine. And we know this, that a medicine taken to enough a degree is a poison, and the argument of Pendle and many other poison pathers is the opposite, that what can look like a poison, or what in some ways is a poison or an intoxicant, can, again, as a matter of dosage or a matter of framework or a matter of approach, be an illuminating agent, a medicine for spirit, if not also for the body. So the way of the poison path is Pendle's phrase for the work or the practice of engaging psychoactives, particularly plant psychoactives, as part of a larger spiritual, aesthetic, psychological path of growth and investigation. A path that he will also call Gnostic, or in the idea of Pharmakognosis, particularly with those compounds that seem to bring on extraordinary states of mind, not simply passages of pleasure or power or even luminosity, but extreme insight and cosmic implication. But rather than sort of create a story where these things are mystical or something, he will treat them in some sense as a poison, as a product of the earth, which is why, as you'll see in one section, he elevates Eve as sort of the goddess of this path. And it's very resonant as well to our Gnostic revisions of the Garden of Eve story, that Eve and the fundamental prohibition about eating the fruit, and the switcheroo, where if the fruit is actually something positive, then the serpent becomes revalorized as a teaching agent, and Eve becomes a courageous explorer of body and mind rather than an erring, foolish wife. Then all of those associated ideas that in some ways inform the counterculture that has grown up around drug use, it all becomes a little bit more clear and a little bit more powerful. So I hope you enjoy these sections. Another piece that we have in here is by René Daumal, who we saw a few weeks earlier with his whole riff on self-denial and perpetual suicide as a way to keep consciousness awake in the midst of its constant tendency to identify with objects in the world. And in this piece, the determining memory, it has other translations. The title is translated differently in other translations. But here he talks about an experience that he had when he was a young man, when he was one of these punk-ass kids who was going to get together with his other punk-ass friends and start a literary zine called Le Grand Jeu, which was sort of a snotty rival, punk rock rival to the more established surrealist texts and movements and propaganda at the time. So he's a teen. He's doing his drug experimentation, and he huffs some glue, essentially, not quite glue, but a solvent that has extraordinary experiences. And it's a really remarkable, dense, somewhat difficult, but remarkable text in terms of a really courageous attempt to articulate some of the more bizarre and non-mythological, non-mystical aspects of heavy psychedelic experience. One little kind of interesting Gnostic note is the way he sort of characterizes the ordinary world once he begins to enter into his state. He characterizes it as empty, absurd, precise, and necessary. And there's something about all of those words taken together that, to my mind, characterizes some of that existential, not disgust, but sort of lack of pleasure with the conventional world that we see reflected in Gnostic texts. The idea that it's sort of empty and meaningless and absurd, but still somehow necessary, a work of fate, a work of determinism, and that this movement outside of it is in some sense an escape both from emptiness and from necessity. So later in the text, he does a really remarkable job of kind of fine-tuning what it is in the nature of this experience that is so strange and powerful. And I just wanted to mention a few elements of that. One is the impossible geometries. When I'm reading that, I think of descriptions of some DMT experiences where he starts talking about this interplay of half circles and triangles and creating these sort of impossible non-Euclidean geometries, which he describes later. And then there's also this weird word, this kind of buzzing word that seems to sustain him. I didn't write it down. I won't even attempt to say it. But it definitely has an interesting resonance, especially when you think of the sound that Terence McKenna famously made at the notorious experiment at La Chorrera with his brother Dennis in the early 70s, when there was a certain kind of keening call that he could make that would resonate the molecules in the mushroom and produce some connection with these larger cosmic databases. And I really thought about that when I came across Daumal, as a kid in France and whatever, the teens or 20s, taking this peculiar drug and having this sense that there's something about the vibratory quality of the words itself that sustained his experience, not necessarily the experience of the world, but his experience. And then this whole sense of identity, how everything is connected, everything is whole, except he has this little spin on it, which I think is just so remarkable, that if it all seems to be a complete cyclical, self-fulfilling matrix of reality, there's one little gap, there's one little swerve, there's one little error in the system, and that's the self itself. That the self, the perceiver, the one who is experiencing, the one who is flowing through time, that's the little bit of emptiness, or the little bit of grit in this otherwise perfect system of swirling identity. And while a few of us are going to be huffing carbon tetrachloride anytime soon, in fact few of us should, there's some people who believe that Domal's early death was caused partly because, he had tuberculosis, and then he had some other respiratory problems. I don't remember exactly how he died, but it was a lung-related issue. That some people believe it was his ill health was set in motion by these early experiments. But it is interesting, at the end he mentions that a few years after these series of experiments, while receiving some medical help, he received a big dose of nitrous oxide and had more or less the same kind of experience. And it does seem to me, from many of his descriptions, that there's a clear resonance between his accounts here and his accounts and the phenomenology of nitrous oxide. So here we have a different kind of framing of the Gnostic experience of psychoactives, and how it enters in and permeates and undermines our conventional view. It's particularly his note about the certainty of the perception that is extraordinary and remarkable, and the thing that is most difficult probably to communicate to those who have not ventured into these waters, the peculiar quality of certainty that surrounds aspects of the experience, even if the content of those experiences remains elusive and impossible to ground. Speaking of not really grounding, the final section is by John Lilly, probably our most famous psychonaut of ketamine, the anesthetic that was developed, I think, as late as the 1950s. So like LSD, a kind of product of the technological world. Our modern scientific apparatus occasionally stumbles across these shamanic molecules, and they sneak out of the hands of the powers that be. And Lilly was definitely a big fan of ketamine, which is like carbon tetrachloride, a peculiar substance, though it's more safe on the system. Doesn't quite fit into the normal frameworks of psychedelic experience that are organized around tryptamines like psilocybin and other related substances, or the phenethylamines like mescaline, which was, of course, Huxley's first vehicle into the cosmic mysteries. Ketamine it opens up a different kind of world, and what is interesting about Lilly's extensive experiments with this material it's very easy to characterize as flat-out addiction. Ketamine is interesting in that it's really the only psychedelic that produces strongly addictive behavior in some of its users, and Lilly certainly fits in that category. But beyond this is the way that some of Lilly's experiences and descriptions resonate with a certain kind of Gnostic model, a certain vision of Gnostic model, particularly his ideas, as we see in this section, about the solid state reality. The idea being that once we start making sophisticated information machines out of solid state materials, minerals essentially, that we are initiating a process of the development of a mineral-based entity that is ultimately inimical to biological creatures such as ourselves. So it's like we cruised along for millennia, creating an essentially biological basis of consciousness and communication, and then we start fiddling around, the devil's bargain is made, and we create a network of solid-state devices which he sees in one vision will increasingly take over and run reality. So here we have kind of an Archon view of things, one that's based in a sort of mythology of substances, of actual material, biological material versus solid state material, and then the notion that this kind of control systems, because Lilly talks a lot about control, like Burroughs, very interested in elements of control and giving up control and maintaining control, and who has control and power, that the control systems that emerge from the solid state, the expansion of solid state technology, become ambiguous, because the idea is that there are other extraterrestrial forces out in the cosmos that at a certain time will be able to start manipulating, or perhaps have already started manipulating, our solid state devices, and that this creates a kind of conflict between the biological organisms and their cosmic cheer clubs, versus the solid state organisms, which have a more Borg-like quality, clearly. Indeed, the Star Trek image of the Borg seems to be a very powerful archetype for this kind of organization. So you see in Lilly's kind of perspective that there's some kind of machinic quality. And if you remember, this is what's really important, and especially when you're looking at a lot of modern phenomenology around these bizarre worlds, whether it's UFO lore or Lilly's solid state materials, but anytime you're talking about machinery, every time you're talking about mechanism, in some sense that's an image of necessity, an image of fate. That the old Gnostic view of the cosmos, the pessimistic view, that the cosmos was a kind of wheel that was run by these Archons, and that we were stuck in this wheel, and that only through Gnosis could we begin to escape, that idea of the wheel is essentially necessity. It's essentially fate. And the more you look at these ancient documents, not just Gnosticism proper, but also Neoplatonic sources, and as I mentioned before, a lot of Christianity as well, you're going to keep running over and over the same idea, that essentially the world is a matrix of control systems which use us and our consciousness or our emotions or our actions, or just surround us with these mechanisms of control that we can barely escape from, whatever we're thinking we're in our head. And yet there are these ways out where fate becomes providence, where love triumphs over law, and in the Gnostic model, that we escape from this kind of prison. So anytime in modern fringe thinking or fringe experience you come across these images of machines, something like the Borg or something like Lilly, or the way that machines function in a lot of kind of alien culture, or ET stuff, that sometimes what's really being figured, I believe, is a kind of relationship to necessity. And this is also, I believe, something that comes up in certain kinds of psychedelic experience, particularly the type that Domal describes. Domal is not talking about, climbing through the jungle and encountering the jaguar who swallows him, and he goes down the river, and then the feline goddess of night comes and surrounds him with her light beings. That is a kind of experience that some people have. But there's definitely another character of experience that's more like what Domal describes, which has a mechanistic or mathematical or sort of systemic quality, a kind of great whirling engine of wheels within wheels, and this sense of a kind of determination, a kind of necessity, or a kind of propulsion quality, almost as if the awakener or the experiencer is the one bit of free will in this immense network of mechanism and control. And these often somewhat darker scenarios seem to resonate very clearly with aspects of traditional Gnostic experience, and I think that you can very much see that resonance with Lilly's rather wacky autobiography. And just to note that he just talks about himself in the third person, but he did write this book. Well, on that note of wheels within wheels, cheerio.